Today's episode is brought to you by Surfshark. More on them in just a bit. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. Welcome to the show. This one, big one, both in terms of topic, Ted Bundy. You've heard of him. I can't believe we haven't covered him yet. Haven't we done like 100 of these? 100 and something? I saw it ticked over the other day, which was cool. And we've never covered Ted Bundy before. So I've got a 30-page script in front of me. Thank you, David, for writing this. I'm going to keep the intro brief. Just saying, if you enjoy this show, why not leave it a review on iTunes? It's not called iTunes. It's not been called iTunes for years. Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your shows. Whatever. Let's just jump in. If you're new, the format of the show is that I have not read this before. It is new to me. And, it's called a cold read. Although the story of Ted Bundy is obviously not new to me. It's probably not new to you either. But let's just jump in, shall we? Did I mention it's written by David? Thank you, David. The show is edited by Jen. Thank you, Jen. And, of course, I'm Simon. Let's roll. It was the night of January the 14th, 1978, in Tallahassee, Florida, and a monster, cloaked in human skin, was preparing to rape and murder a house full of sorority girls. Kathy Kleiner, the 20-year-old student at Florida State University, had been out at a wedding. She returned to the Chi Omega sorority house. Thank you for the pronunciation, Guy David. I would have got that wrong. Where she had recently become a member. She used her key to enter the front door of the building alongside the other sorority girls arriving home from a Saturday night full of social events, parties, and dates with promising young men. Given there was a lock on the front door, the doors of the individual dormitories had no locks whatsoever. Kathy Kleiner chatted briefly with her roommate Karen Chandler before going to sleep at around 10:30 p.m. Lurking across the street from the Chi Omega house, concealed from view, was a man. He had been there all night. In fact, he had been there for several nights in the past week. Watching. Oh god, it's Ted Bundy, isn't it? Ted Bundy, why? The man, his eyes shining with the lustful memory of the ensuing rape and violence, would later describe the situation in the third person to avoid incriminating himself. To quote, "He's been closely observing the scene and closely observing the victims for some period of time. There's hunting involved and a certain amount of expertise, and there's something of an art to it. His hunt is somewhat simplified by the fact that he understands where the victims are." That is a really weird thing to say. It makes it sound like what you're doing is like somehow complicated and thoughtful, Ted. Whereas really, it's just like, I'm watching a house and I'm going to go in there and do some raping. That's it. Ted, come on. Let's not self-aggrandize too much already with 3 paragraphs in. It has been 2 years since his last kill, and the man intended to make up for lost time. The psychopath in the bushes had arrived in Tallahassee on the morning of January the 8th, 6 days prior. He spent his first night in a hotel, and the next day he rented a room at a boarding house just 4 blocks from the Chi Omega sorority house. The name he gave the landlord was Chris Hagen. The man was 31 years old, 5'10", handsome, soft-spoken, and effortlessly.
I thought you said you had this under control.
Someone even told me how to fucking say the word and stop adding that extra syllable in there. And I was saying it. I was reading this email. I was like, oh my god, you just clarified it for me perfectly. And I was like saying it perfectly. And now I can't again. Why am I so stupid? Let's just say he was charming, alright? It wasn't long before he made the acquaintance of a young woman who lived across the hall and took her out for a dinner date. When later interviewed by the media, the woman giggled and said that she preferred to keep the details to herself. Chris, as he called himself, spent the next few days laying on the beach and soaking in the sunshine. He applied for a job at a construction site to earn a bit of money, but when they asked him to provide ID, he abandoned the idea. He's like, oh no, I was looking for something sketch, mate. It had only been 2 weeks since he'd escaped from prison in Colorado. Wow, I didn't realize Ted Bundy had escaped from prison. I feel like I know this story, but apparently not that well. I've definitely made videos about Ted Bundy. I think I've done a biographics episode about Ted Bundy, which is a YouTube channel I do with biographies. Instead, the man stole food from grocery stores and lifted money and credit cards from women's purses. It was with this collection of stolen credit cards that he kept himself afloat. Meanwhile, the man turned his attention toward Florida State University. He desperately desired to rape a woman and kill her. It had been too long. The monster inside him was starving. Oh no, I do remember he went to prison. I mean, like, for a shorter stretch, right? I had forgotten he had escaped. Like, wasn't he in prison for some lesser crime? Is that possible? The man continued to watch the Chi Omega girls arrive home. At 2 a.m. on the morning of January the 15th, he struck. Crossing the road, the man approached a pile of firewood by the side of the building and picked up a thick, heavy log to use as a bludgeon. He then entered the Chi Omega building via a back door. He had broken the lock to the door a few days earlier. The man entered the room of Margaret Bowman, aged 21, who was fast asleep in bed. Raising the oak log high into the air, he struck Margaret several times in the head, as hard as he could, to make sure she would stay unconscious. You're hitting her with a giant log in the head? Making sure she's going to stay dead, mate. Like, that is a murder. The purpose of this was to avoid her waking up and screaming and alerting the rest of the sorority house. The man intended to kill everyone in the building that night, going room to room, dispatching each young woman, one by one, as they slept. The man then proceeded to rape Margaret Bowman in a sexual frenzy that did not take long but was quite violent. He scratched and tore at her flesh. He bit her skin. He yanked out strands of her hair. Within a few minutes, it was all over, and the bludgeoned woman had not regained consciousness. The man then took a nylon stocking, wrapped it tightly around Margaret Bowman's neck, and strangled her to death. She died without knowing what had happened to her. The man then took the makeshift bludgeon in his hand and proceeded to beat Margaret Bowman's head until her skull split open. Working systematically, the man went down the hall to another room. Inside was 20-year-old Lisa Levy, who was fast asleep. He took the log and beat her over the head multiple times so that she, too, would stay unconscious. His refractory period was not finished, so the man did not penetrate the victim, but he savagely molested her, tearing off one of her nipples with his teeth and taking a nearby hairspray bottle and shoving it into her vagina. The man also bit the girl several times more, like an animal, leaving marks that made a distinct impression of his teeth upon her skin. That's what you call evidence, mate. He's like, you've escaped from prison, so you're on file. They're gonna very quickly know that it's you, mate. What are you up to? Thereupon, the man throttled Lisa Levy with his bare hands in order to kill her. He got up and headed to the next room. It was at this point that the man entered the room of Kathy Kleiner and a roommate Karen Chandler. Kathy Kleiner had been woken up by the man's entry to, quote, "I remember hearing someone come into our room and seeing a dark figure standing next to my bed. It was just evil. I remember him with his arm up and then him hitting me. I tried to scream. I touched my face. It was sticky and I didn't realize it was blood. I turned to the side and saw all the blood was splattered on the wall. And my brand new comforter, my sheets, and my pillows were all just covered in blood." I always like it when there's a quote later from someone describing the crime because you're like, oh, good, at least someone survived. As horrible as it is. I mean, obviously it's a horrible thing to go through, but it's not death. So at least there's that.
If you're happy and you know it, say hooray.
Across the room, Karen Chandler woke up, and before she could make a sound, the man dashed across the room and beat her brutally with the oak log. Chandler raised her arm to protect herself. The impact of the bludgeon promptly broke it and crushed one of her fingers. The man proceeded to break her jaw in 3 places and knock out several teeth before stunning her with a direct blow to the temple. At this point, a car pulled up alongside the Chi Omega house. The headlights shined through the window, lighting up the room in which the man now stood over 2 injured and defenseless young women. The 2:15 a.m. arrival of another person was unexpected and could cause problems. As a fugitive from a Colorado prison, he could not afford to get caught. The man left, dude, you can't afford to. You've just committed crimes which are going to see you in prison forever. Or get the chair. Or needle, or whatever they had back in 1978. They did execute. Ted Bundy was executed. How was he executed? I guess we're going to find out. But, dude, you've just committed so many crimes that I know you'll go back to Colorado prison, but they're probably going to send you to special death row prison after this. Did I just spoil it? We all know Ted Bundy gets killed, right? Like, that's not a spoiler. Ted Bundy gets executed. It's Ted Bundy. We knew this. The man left the room and bolted toward the front door of the sorority house. Coming through the back door with the busted lock was a woman named Nita Neary, who saw the man briefly before he made his escape. The whole attack took a total of 15 minutes, while 30 more sorority girls slept peacefully in their beds, unaware of how close they too may have come to a brutal beating and even death. He really thought he was going to be able to murder 30 people. You murdered 1 or 2, or and beat 2, murdered 2, beat 1 or 2. Look, you didn't. You're delusional. Thinking the man was a burglar, Nita Neary ran upstairs and woke her roommate Nancy. The two then exited the room to wake up Chi Omega's quote-unquote house mother to tell her what had happened. What is a house mother? Is that like someone who lives with you to take care of you? You're in your 20s. Take care of yourselves. But when they entered the hallway, they saw Karen Chandler concussed, sopping with blood, staggering aimlessly forward, clinging to the walls, leaving fresh trails of blood behind her. Nancy went to Karen's aid, while Nita ran to the house mother's room to wake her up. They then went to check on Kathy Kleiner, who was sitting on the edge of her bed, bleeding profusely. At that point, the sorority girls made a panicked phone call to the police. They did not realize there were 2 more victims, either dead or dying in the house. At 2:45 a.m., Leon County Sheriff Ken Casares received a call about the Chi Omega attack. When he arrived at the scene, Karen Chandler was taken out on a stretcher, alive, but in critical condition. Kathy Kleiner was being checked out by a paramedic, blood soaked in her hair and staining her entire face red. Margaret Bowman was being taken out in a body bag. Lisa Levy was being rushed to a hospital, where she soon died. To quote Sheriff Casares, "It was a rage. This demon was having a frenzy. It shocked all of us. And we'd seen brutalization before. The killer attempted to be organized, like it was necessary to do things in order. But you could tell that the person who did this was losing control. Looking at the bodies of those 2 ladies, I promised myself he would never have the opportunity to do that again, if I could find him." Meanwhile, the man was not far away, fleeing the scene on foot. After running 8 blocks from the sorority home, he lurked quietly around for an hour, peering into windows. He wasn't finished yet. Back at the Chi Omega house, you're pushing your luck, mate. You really are. You're just sloppy. Back at the Chi Omega house, the police radio crackled. A woman living in a duplex had been woken up by the sound of loud thudding noises coming from the apartment next to hers. Amid the thuds came the sound of a woman yelling. It sounded like somebody was being beaten within an inch of their life. The witness telephoned next door. Nobody answered. So frightened, she phoned the police. When Sheriff Casares heard the call come over the radio, he thought, quote, "Could it be the same person having gone to another location?" I said no. In all my studies of criminals and their methods, they do something like the Chi Omega attack and they're on the lam. They're gone. They don't want to be around. They're certainly not going to commit another crime. I agree. I think that is the sort of rational thing to do. Oh God, go on the run. Right? And I think we see this all the time in the other Casual Criminalist episodes. But the way this was such a frenzy, and I guess they don't know that the frenzy was interrupted. I mean, I guess that they maybe they do. But they don't know what his intention was. They didn't know that he wanted to kill so many people. So I guess they don't know that his frenzy could continue. But I mean, give it a shot. You're gonna go check it out anyway, right? Just at least what's it in the movies where they there's that little button or the popper on their gun holster. You just see that shot of them as they pop it off, gun ready to go. Let's go catch Ted Bundy. Well, when Casares sent an investigator over the duplex, they found 21-year-old dance major Cheryl Thomas sitting on her bed, covered in blood. She was barely conscious and her clothes had been torn off. At the foot of the bed was a mask that had been worn by the assailants. The man had attacked Cheryl with the oak log, broken the young woman's jaw, cracked her skull in 5 places, and dislocated her shoulder. There were traces of semen on the bed indicating the victim had been raped. The injuries Cheryl Thomas sustained left her permanently deaf, and the brain damage affected her balance, thus ending the young woman's dance career before it even got started. If her neighbor had not telephoned and startled the attacker, she would almost certainly be dead. After the attack on Cheryl Thomas, the man disappeared into the night. Police were left with very little clues as to who would have committed such a horrendous series of crimes in one fell swoop. It was clear that the police were dealing with a sexual sadist and a lust-based killer who had been interrupted at Chi Omega before he could satiate his urges. As Sheriff Casares put it, he didn't get a few blocks before he found that he couldn't help himself again. When the police asked Captain Burl Peacock of the Tallahassee Police what sort of person they had on their hands, his reply was blunt and to the point. Well, I think we've got a very disturbed, sick individual. Meet Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Cal was born on the 24th. So I was just thinking, I like the name Theodore. It's a nice name, like Ted. How has that not been ruined by Ted Bundy? It's it's nice. It's kind of cute. I like that. What the f***'s that? What are you thinking about that now? What's wrong with you? Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November the 24th, 1946, to Louise Cowell, then 22 years old, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. Louise had been impregnated by a returning veteran of World War II who wanted nothing to do with the child. After giving birth, Louise abandoned baby Ted at the Lund Home and returned to her parents in Philadelphia, 400 miles away. Upon hearing this, Louise's father, Samuel Cowell, told his daughter to get her ass back to Vermont and collect the child. In order to avoid a scandal, Samuel and his wife Eleanor raised Ted as their son, even though Eleanor was 51 at the time and no longer capable of giving birth. The real mother, Louise, posed as Ted's sister. I mean, this is better than, like, it could be. And I think Ted Bundy's like a natural psychopath, right? He was born this way. I made that video so long ago that I realized I've forgotten large amounts of this story. I've just got like the vague brushstrokes of Ted Bundy in my mind. But this actually sounds like, considering the situation, relatively stable, which is nice. Although Ted would later state that he had a positive and stable upbringing, by multiple accounts his grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was physically abusive to his wife, children, and even the family dog. There are even... never mind, I take it back. There are even reports that Samuel suffered from hallucinations and heard voices. His wife, Eleanor, most likely suffered from bipolar disorder and agoraphobia. Ted showed a disturbing fascination with violence at an early age. When Ted was 3 years old, Louise's sister, Julia, awoke to find the young boy had placed kitchen knives on her bed, surrounding her with them. Julia looked up to see the young Ted just stood there, smiling at her. How old was he? He's 3. Oh, God.
That's creepy.
Yeah.
This is, I mean, if it wasn't Ted Bundy and you didn't know, you'd be like, that is the sort of thing when a kid does something creepy and you're like, I'm trying to think of something my kid's done that's creepy. And then you're like, I don't know, just like, I can't think of anything. My kids are too sweet. But it's the sort of thing you'd see just a kid like got their hands on a knife and is just smiling manically. And you'd be like, they're a 3-year-old. Don't read too much into it. But when it's Ted Bundy, you're like, uh-oh, what? In 1950, Louise recognized Ted as her son and legally changed her surname to Nelson to avoid a scandal. She relocated from Philadelphia to Tacoma, Washington State, where she lived with her cousins Alan and Jane Scott in order to have a fresh start. The following year, in May 1951, Louise married a hospital cook named Johnny Bundy, who formally adopted Ted. In order to keep things simple, Louise told the 5-year-old that Johnny Bundy was his real father. Johnny and Louise went on to have 4 more children together. In Tacoma, Washington, they were ostensibly a devout and respectable Methodist family. Growing up, Ted didn't play much with his half-siblings and had little respect for his stepfather, whom he despised as a fairly stupid blue-collar worker. Bit of a snob there, are you, Ted? Are you? Ted was born a congenital psychopath, a neurological condition that affects roughly 1 in 100 people, which every time I hear that statistic blows my mind. It's like, I think of places I've been where there's like hundreds of people. So like you're in a big like audience at a conference, or you're at school. I think there were 500 kids in my school, plus I don't know how many teachers. So let's say like, I don't know, 500-600 people. So in those assemblies, you know, you're sitting down and the headmaster's talking, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, statistically, there are 5 people in this room who do not have like empathy. What was that? How is it defined? It means his brain was less capable of generating feelings of empathy for other people or placing himself in their shoes and understanding their emotions. Well, that's not quite, he doesn't have him, like, okay, so maybe, I'm not sure if that's the definition or not, but what, like, it exactly is. But that doesn't mean he has no emotions. He's just less capable. But there are 5 people who are, I imagine it's like substantially less capable in that group of 500 who have this. And that's so high. There are like people you've met. There are people your friends. Maybe even you, dear listener. I mean, statistically, yeah. There are a lot of you listening. It's kind of weird, isn't it?
Not everyone's a murdering psychopath.
I mean, not you, the prevalence. But also, yeah, you. A little bit, right? Please don't murder me. And I also understand that just because you're a psychopath doesn't mean you're a murderer. Obviously not. There are 1 in 100 people are not murderers. That would be really intense. Instead, Ted would keep aloof from most people throughout his childhood and would gradually learn to ape the appropriate behaviors that would bring him rewards and keep him out of trouble. As such, Ted inevitably grew to be something of a two-faced liar. Later in life, Ted would also be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, meaning he had an inflated sense of self-worth and was obsessed with his personal image, projecting a personality and series of accomplishments that did not reflect reality. This disorder also left him with a fragile ego and deeply rooted feelings of self-loathing because he could not live up to to the image that he projected of himself. Combined with something called Machiavellian thinking or a dog-eat-dog mentality where the ends justify the means, psychopathy and narcissism form the so-called dark triad. Wow, it's like the second episode in a row where we've mentioned this. I mean, obviously not for you listening, because these don't come out in the order I record them typically, but the last one I recorded, we were just talking about that. Generally associated with career criminals and many serial killers, psychiatrists would also diagnose Ted Bundy with bipolar disorder, where he would have long bursts of fitful activity followed by periods of dark-minded lethargy. While psychopathy, NPD, and bipolar are all serious mental illnesses, they do not ipso facto mean the sufferer will grow up to be a criminal. Quite the contrary, numerous people struggle with these conditions their entire lives, both from their own internal demons and from social stigma. But for Bundy, they formed a rather malevolent cocktail that, combined with his life experiences, led him to become the epitome of a modern predatory killer, an old true crime classic. Due to his psychopathy, growing up, Ted did not immediately understand social cues in the same way that others do. He was baffled at exactly how one made friends, or even why one wanted to. Ted's early response was to withdraw from what he did not understand. This gave the impression that Ted was shy. As a result of this perceived shyness, Ted was initially bullied at school. Some of these experiences were quite humiliating, and they only fueled Ted's self-loathing. In order to compensate emotionally, Ted's narcissism and general feelings of superiority over everyone else only got worse. Ted Bundy fantasized about being the smartest boy in his class, about being president one day. Whoa. That's ambitious, my dude. And about being the best athlete and the most popular kid in school. In reality, his grades were remarkably average, largely because Ted did not put in effort and did not enjoy reading. He was also not much of an athlete and only showed a talent for downhill skiing, which he indulged in by stealing equipment and forging ski lift tickets. And instead of being popular, Ted was something of a loner. As a boy and early adolescent, he did not interact well with girls, and he remained a virgin well into adulthood. In 1961, when Ted Bundy was 14 years old, his ego received another blow. He found a birth certificate in an old trunk in the attic, which listed his father's identity as unknown. Although Ted would later claim that he didn't care about illegitimacy, the discovery essentially destroyed Ted's image of a high-flying, all-American boy who came from a respectable 1950s and 1960s family. Didn't he say that he loathed his father? I mean, yeah, people have contradictions, of course they do. It's just that, it's so close together, it feels so obvious. Instead, he was, in his own words, a bastard who was wanted neither by his biological father nor, initially, by his mother. If he had been born a generation or two later, he almost certainly would have been aborted. Yikes. All of these cracks in Ted's facade grew increasingly frustrating for him, and so Ted sought an outlet for such feelings of frustration: violence. Prior to his teenage years, this came in the form of playing with knives and other weapons, catching and killing frogs at a nearby creek, and generally marveling at cruelty to animals and stories of violence in the media. Yeah, look, if your kid is really into violence, I feel that's it. Don't sweat that one too much, because it's I don't know, there's violent video games, there's violent movies. Kids like violence. I don't know, I love playing Doom and GTA, and it's again, you make that, it's one of the craziest things. It's number of civilians I've killed in GTA, hundreds. Number of civilians I've killed in real life, 0. And that holds true for almost everybody. But the torturing and killing of animals and stuff, that's intense. That's intense. Get that sorted out, okay? Ted was also fond of making tiger traps in the woods. A tiger trap is where you dig a hole a few feet deep and line it with sharpened sticks. You then cover the hole with branches and leaves. One time, a little girl fell into one of Ted's tiger traps, and she had to be rushed to hospital because one of the pikes had sliced open her leg. Ted, that's intense, man. If you dig a hole, you gotta fill that hole back in. Come on. It's dangerous. Despite remaining a virgin, when Ted progressed into adolescence, he became fascinated with sex. Ted initially took to being a peeping Tom. He'd go out in the late evening and look through the windows of people's homes in the hope of seeing women in a state of undress. From there, Ted began to steal pornography from shops and forage it from trash bins. Ah, yes. Used porn.
A classic.
The type of porn progressed from rather vanilla nudity to full-on BDSM with female submissives placed in degrading and painful positions. From there, Ted became absorbed by magazines, dime novels, and TV shows that portrayed sexual violence. He became aroused by pictures of beaten, disfigured, and dead women. It's interesting here because often, we've seen this before, obviously, 100 episodes. This is not a super uncommon theme. But often there's been like some particularly negative female figure in these people's lives. Often the mother who was like abusive, beat them, just made them feel like a piece of crap for their whole childhood. But it doesn't seem this way with Bundy. So like it makes you wonder where this came from. This transformation occurred quite quickly after the start of Ted's sexual awakening. He began to associate sexual arousal with violence, which was aided by his lack of empathy, and by roughly the age of 14, he had become a full-blown sexual sadist. Bundy later said, behind the veil of the third person to avoid incriminating himself, is this like Ted Bundy's version of allegedly? Just talk about yourself in the third person. And one time it'd be like, yeah, and then oh no, I misspoke. He said that his upbringing in Tacoma was, quote, positive but not positive enough, not enduring, not strong enough to overcome the urges or compulsions that resulted. He would deal with women every day, but not sexually, because those impulses he kept separate from his everyday life. Like a hobby. Oh, yes. This is so confusing, because I feel like I'm reading David's words, because we're talking about him in the third person, but this is him speaking about himself, allegedly. Let me just go back so I can read that again. He would deal with women every day, but not sexually, because those impulses he kept separate from everyday life. Like a hobby collecting stamps, he didn't retain the taste of glue on his tongue all day long. But in a broader, more abstract way, sexual violence began to preoccupy him. On August the 31st, end quote, just to make it clear. On August the 31st, 1961, when Bundy was just 14, 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr was abducted from her home in a neighborhood where Bundy delivered newspapers. Anne-Marie's father had seen Bundy lurking around the same day she disappeared. Police found one shoe print at the crime scene, which from the size and make they believe belonged to a teenage male. Anne-Marie's body was never found. Oh, good lord. He murdered someone when he was 14? How do I forget this stuff? That's so crazy. I know he started young, but 14? I was like, surely she's found fine. And she just talks about how super creepy Ted Bundy is. No. Oh my. From the ages of 14 to 18 at Woodrow Wilson High School, Ted Bundy finally learned how to ape the behaviors of his peers, and he became charming, charismatic, and confident. He grew tall, handsome, and even somewhat debonair. He was soft-spoken and fairly popular with the girls. Nevertheless, Ted did not date much, and he did not have sex. He had difficulty relating to girls on an honest and intimate level, and vanilla sex held no appeal for him. At school, Ted developed a liking for politics, as have many psychopaths before him and since. Also, during those...
I see what you did there.
Yeah, slight dig at politicians there, but it's got to attract more psychos, right? It just has to. Because on one, I completely understand. You get these things. I think Oprah's the example that's always given. And it's like, why doesn't Oprah run for president? Because either way, half the country's going to hate her afterwards. And if you're okay with half the people hating you, even though they don't know you, they're just not hating, but just not liking. And I feel politics is so polarized these days that there are a lot of people who actually hate the president who is not in their political party. It feels rare to hear someone be like, oh, they're fine. It's like they're not my party. They don't represent what I believe and my views, but they're not bad. They're just them. But it's always people. And what was my point with this? Yeah, you've got to be a little bit psycho to be just totally okay with so many people hating you. Or is that just I don't know, I just want people to like me. Maybe too much. Also, during these teenage years, Ted began to engage in petty crimes, breaking into houses and stealing cars. Ted's own statements in later life also imply that during this time, he'd get drunk and stalk women, perhaps even going so far as harming them as they made their way home. According to Bundy, the alcohol helped him overcome his inhibitions and indulge his impulse towards violence. We know that Bundy was arrested twice, but we shall never know for sure what he got up to since his juvenile record was wiped clean when he reached adulthood. Graduating from high school at the age of 18 in 1965, Bundy stayed in Tacoma and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound. He studied psychology and Asian studies for 2 semesters. Interesting choice, psychology. In early 1966, Bundy transferred to the University of Washington and went to live in Seattle. He paid his way by working as unskilled labor in restaurants and stores, but he never kept a job for long because his employers found him unreliable and because Bundy openly resented their authority over him. It's not a good vibe, is it? It's like, just don't know. That's your boss. Respect him. Did I tell the story? There was a guy, when I was a kid, I worked in a store, and there was some dude who I thought he was my boss for 6 months. And then eventually he was like, I'm not your boss, right? And I'm like, what? And it's like, this other dude's your boss. And I thought he was your boss. But yeah, so I was like, yeah, really respectful to this dude. And then I just found out that he was also just an assistant in the store. He even had a badge that said the same thing as me. I just assumed he was my boss for some reason. It's not relevant. Why are we on this tangent? Let's just go back to the story. One such position of Bundy's was his job as a bag boy at a grocery store in the Seattle neighborhood of Queen Anne. Nearby was a basement apartment rented by 2 flight attendants, Lisa Wick and Lonnie Trumbull, both aged 20. On the evening of the 23rd of June, 1966, an unidentified male broke into their apartment and subdued the women by hitting them both on the head with a plank of wood. The man then proceeded to violently rape the 2 flight attendants before bludgeoning them again. Lonnie Trumbull was beaten so savagely about the head that she was killed. Lisa Wick suffered brain damage and memory loss, but she swore for decades that her assailant was none other than Ted Bundy. While it is unclear when Bundy first began murdering women, most experts agree that his kill count is higher than the canonical murders that have been officially attributed to him. Some estimates range as high as 100 women. As a congenital psychopath and a sexual sadist at an early age, Bundy had all the pathological drive behind him in 1966 to have committed the assaults on Wick and Trumbull. The attack bears a haunting similarity to the Chi Omega slayings in 1978, and if Bundy was not killing women at this point, he was almost certainly stalking and sexually assaulting them. Bundy justified such activities by depersonalizing his victims and viewing their murders as quote-unquote a necessary act to satisfy a deeply rooted hunger he could not ignore. That is such a psycho thing to say, dude. What the f***? Bundy needed to kill just as much as he needed to eat, drink, and breathe. And to his mind, it wasn't his fault that he was made this way. When Bundy was later interviewed in prison, he suddenly asked, how does a soldier deal with killing in a war? The interviewer answered, well, you see, he has a justification built in there. To which Bundy simply replied, so does the mass murderer. You don't understand justification. There's different levels of justification. You're a justified kill by what is going on outside? They've been digging up the street. I don't know if you can hear that. I know this microphone's very only sensitive to where my voice is, but there is some proper construction going on outside, but I'm not actually upset about it because they're putting fiber into my building, which I'm very excited about. I hope you guys can't hear that. Now, just before we continue with today's episode, let me tell you about today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Look, there aren't just criminals in true crime podcasts. There are criminals out there in the world, probably different criminals, cyber criminals, digital criminals, hackers, crackers, all of those people on the internet. Look, you might be out and about. I don't know, the place I always use as an example, I like Starbucks. I have to go to Starbucks. I'll do a little worky work in Starbucks, and they got that Starbucks free Wi-Fi. And you're like, that is an unsecured Wi-Fi network. Is that safe? Is that safe? Well, you just don't know. But with Surfshark, what you do know is that you are safe because you are hidden behind a wall of Surfshark's next generation encryption, which is exactly what you need. Then, I don't know, I'll be on there and I'll be like, I'll just log into my internet banking, I'll log into my PayPal. If I didn't have Surfshark, there is no way I would do that. It's just not worth the risk. Look, probably you're going to be fine. Probably there's no one on that Starbucks network being like, ha 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 ha, I'm going to steal your information and your money. Probably you'll be fine. But, just in case, that one time there is someone there. And there's that one time your bank account and your identity and all of that personal stuff gets stolen. And you don't want that. Look, for me, also that security thing is fantastic. But what I really love about Surfshark is the increased streaming options. Look, if you open up Netflix, browse your local Netflix options, and then close it down, fire up Surfshark, and then load Netflix again, and you will see a completely different array of movies. I've personally seen on American Netflix, which I use through, Surfshark allegedly, is I went on there and I had the Surfshark running, and there were no Mission Impossible movies. So I switched Surfshark over to a different country, and then all the Mission Impossible movies were on there. I was like, how does this work? But I like it. Same for The Office. The Office US wasn't available on US Netflix, but it is totally available on my local Netflix. So jump on over to Europe and enjoy shows that you otherwise wouldn't get. Look, Surfshark make all of this possible. Oh, and if you maybe a game's not available in your region and you want to download, or it's cheaper than somewhere else, use Surfshark for that as well. Look, all you need to do is go to surfshark.deals/criminalist and enter the promo code criminalist to get 83% off and 3 extra months for free. Again, surfshark.deals/criminalist. There's a link below. And now back to today's video. The love of a psychopath. While Bundy was not particularly attentive at his low-level part-time jobs, he did throw himself into his studies at the University of Washington, where he briefly took Chinese. In order to become respected and eventually become a rising star in politics, Bundy realized that he needed to do well academically. He needed to get a degree and then go into something like business or law. In 1967, Bundy took a class that was also attended by a young woman named Diane Edwards. She was gorgeous, dressed elegantly, and she had long brown hair, which she parted down the middle. Diane came from a wealthy and privileged family in California. Quite illuminating of Diane's character, for a high school yearbook photo, she chose the quote, "Beauty and grace command the world." Ted Bundy saw Diane Edwards and immediately became infatuated with her. She was like no girl he'd ever seen before. Diane was a bit out of his league, both in terms of social class and with her own romantic preferences, but for a narcissist like Bundy, she looked like his ticket to the high life. Diane mostly dated jocks, which intimidated him. Nonetheless, Ted sidled up to Diane and turned on the old Bundy charm. They bonded over their mutual love of downhill skiing, at which Diane was actually better than Bundy. Bundy's seductions worked, and the two became a couple. They took long drives together, holding hands, and as Bundy puts it, whispering sweet nothings into each other's ears. Bundy was quite taken with the idea of Diane. Quote, "She's a beautiful dresser, beautiful girl, very personable, nice car, great parents. So, for a first-time girlfriend, really it was not too bad." So, it just sounds creepy, Bundy. It's like you don't understand love, and you're just like, yeah, look, objectively, this all makes sense, doesn't it? It's like, okay. I mean, these are all great things, but it doesn't sound like you actually like her. You just like the idea of her. As the above quote from Bundy implies, the things he admired about Diane were mostly superficial. Well, she's personable, and I think, yeah, that's kind of it. Everything else is just like, nice car. Okay. It's unlikely Bundy ever felt anything approaching selfless love or devotion. He was incapable of that. Instead, having a society girlfriend bolstered his own bloated ego and his fragile self-image. Diane was a Republican, an old-fashioned and classy girl, no sex or marriage type, and she had certain expectations for any prospective husband. He had to be respectable, have a good job, and be able to keep up with her in privileged social circles. Bundy, slaving away at menial jobs, did not cut a very promising figure, but he did have a lot of confidence and charm, and he was able to convince Diane that he was going places. Yet Bundy spent their entire relationship secretly tormented by the thought that he was not good enough for her. To quote, "I experienced a number of insecurities with Diane. There were occasions when I felt she expected a great deal more than I was really capable of giving." Yeah, this is okay, though. I think someone at this age, when you're still in, university or college or whatever, and you have, menial jobs and stuff, it's like, yeah, but I think you go in places, you're working on it, you got a whole career and life ahead of you. I think people could, she just happens, she's, from a rich family and stuff. But, I don't know, social mobility's a thing, right? Come on. Why was my next line going to be, give Ted Bundy a break? Come on, he's a good guy. Oh my god, he's already murdered people. He murdered someone when he was 14, allegedly. Don't have any sympathy for poor Ted Bundy, fact boy. Jesus.
Well, why are you so nice to him?
Meanwhile, Bundy was having trouble deciding what he wanted to do for a university major. He knew that he wanted to be a big shot, but he didn't have the patience or maturity to plan out a pathway to get there. As such, in early 1968, Bundy took a break from Washington University and continued to pay his way working low-level jobs. This did not impress Diane very much, but Bundy also began to volunteer in politics, and he promised Diane that he was going to gain a foothold in this area. He got involved in Nelson Rockefeller's unsuccessful presidential campaign and became the driver and bodyguard of Arthur Fletcher, a candidate for lieutenant governor. While Bundy enjoyed his time volunteering in politics, he was a little more than a lackey. In August 1968, he attended the Republican National Convention in Miami. There, he had normal sex with a woman for the first time. After his return, an oblivious, still virginal Diane graduated from the University of Washington and took a job working in San Francisco. Her relationship with Bundy became long distance. Frustrated by his lack of maturity and direction in life, and also by her intuition that Bundy was something of a cad and a liar, Diane's letters grew less and less frequent, and they eventually stopped. The rejection was a shattering blow for a pathological narcissist like Bundy. It obliterated many of the illusions he had created for himself about becoming a person of note, a potential US president. Without the classy and privileged Diane on his arm, Bundy was just a college dropout who worked low-wage jobs. Yeah, why drop out of college? That is such a strange contradiction. It's like, and it's the immaturity in not being able to plot out the path seems like quite a strange thing for him not to be able to do when he's got, like, you know, very few emotions. It's like, it's like, here I am at point A, there is point B, I need to work out this path in between. I feel like someone with a logical mind, like, I'm a very logical minded person, and it's like, okay, you could just figure it out, right? And dropping out of college, it's just like, it goes against everything. Like, his narcissism, his wanting to be a big shot, the way he sees himself, all of this. It's really very strange. A driftless no-hoper. A loser. Bundy coped with this psychological blow by falling into alcohol abuse and at one point was counseled at a Seattle crisis center for having suicidal tendencies. He grew to hate Diane on a level that few of us will ever understand. He began to plot his revenge against her, and it is notable that many of Bundy's victims from this point forward looked remarkably similar to Diane Edwards. In late 1968 and early 1969, Bundy traveled southeast into Colorado and then into Arkansas and then north to Philadelphia. There he enrolled for one semester at Temple University. He also made a foray to Burlington, Vermont, the town of his birth, to look at birth records and confirm that he was in fact illegitimate. This may have compounded the negative feelings he was already feeling. Bundy himself reports that the spring and summer of 1969 were an alcohol-fueled haze for him. On May the 30th, 1969, Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both aged 19, disappeared somewhere between Atlantic City, New Jersey and Somers Point. Their car had been found on the Garden State Parkway, roughly 60 miles southeast of Philadelphia. Their bodies were found 3 days later in the woods nearby. They had been sexually interfered with and stabbed to death. Bundy was in the area at the time. He also once confessed to killing 2 women early on in his career in the Philadelphia area. At the time, Bundy was wearing a phony leg cast, claiming that he'd been in a car crash. There's no record of any such collision. If Bundy was the culprit, it's likely he feigned being injured to lure the women into helping him, whereupon he abducted them, transported them to a second location, and murdered them. This fits with Bundy's known MO. Yeah, I mean, what are the odds that someone just happens to be killing people just like Bundy where Bundy is and no one's ever come forward or been caught for it later? Come on. It's Ted Bundy. Also, I don't want to write it off. You shouldn't write it off because there could be some other killer out there who's like, oh my God, it's really lucky that Ted Bundy cropped it for that one, right? Jesus. Returning to Seattle in autumn of 1969, Bundy started a relationship with Liz Klopfer. She was a 23-year-old single mother from Ogden, Utah. She worked as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Liz was mousy, submissive, and for a time became enamored with Bundy's charm. In terms of looks, admittedly, the handsome Ted was a little out of Liz Klopfer's league. As such, Bundy felt that he could use and manipulate Liz quite easily. To Bundy, she was a useful idiot. She also was disposable. Bundy frequently two-timed her with other women like divorcee Carol Ann Boone, and his sex life with Liz was not very active. But Liz held out hope that she could eventually win Bundy over and convince him to marry her. Yeah, with all of his extracurricular activities, he sounds like a real catch. For several years, Liz and Ted formed a family unit with Liz's 3-year-old daughter Molly. When Molly became an adult, she would claim Ted Bundy sexually molested her on multiple occasions, but for now, Bundy had appropriated the mask of family man, which he wore to disguise the fact that he was becoming an increasingly dangerous predator. A dish best served cold. Bundy now focused his energies on rising in society in order to prove to the world that he was worth a damn. In 1970, he went back to University of Washington and chose psychology as his major. His grades improved remarkably from his previous semesters. He volunteered for several community programs like Seattle Suicide Hotline. With about 8 gallons of irony, he sat on a committee to prevent sexual violence against women and even co-authored a pamphlet on rape prevention. I mean, I don't know what to say to that. Ted Bundy co-authored a pamphlet on rape prevention. Ted fucking Bundy. Bundy continued to be active in Republican politics and soon became known as a likable, confident, and charismatic figure. Bundy also saved a 3-year-old Seattle boy from drowning and was hailed by the police as a hero. Throughout all of these exploits, Diane Edwards was never far from Bundy's thoughts. On July the 19th, 1971, 24-year-old Rita Curran, who worked as an elementary school teacher and a part-time motel maid, was murdered in her apartment in Burlington, Vermont, located not far from the unwed mother's home where Bundy was born. A man had broken in during the night, bludgeoned Rita while she slept, raped her unconscious body, and then strangled her to death. This matches Bundy's MO. We do not know Bundy's whereabouts at the time of Rita's murder. He did, however, once confess to murdering a woman in Burlington in 1971. Again, it's like, let's not throw out doing an investigation into that, but also, it was probably Ted Bundy, because he's Ted Bundy! Up to 100. Up to 100, isn't that what David said earlier? Good Lord. 3 days later, on July the 22nd, 1971, back in Seattle, Joyce LePage, aged 21, was abducted from the campus of the University of Washington. In April 1972, her body was found in a remote ravine 280 miles away, draped in blankets and wrapped in a carpet. Her body was decomposed to determine the cause of death, but her skeleton was bound with a rope. Bundy was a student at the time at the same university. It's actually feasible Bundy murdered both Rita and Joyce 3 days apart, since Bundy learned to put a great deal of distance between himself and his recent victims. He was also known to dump bodies in remote areas to prevent their premature discovery. Yeah, I mean, haven't we so far? Like, the bodies weren't found, typically, unless they were discovered at the scene of the crime. When he got rid of the bodies, he got rid of them. So it's kind of unusual this one was found. In 1972, Bundy volunteered for the campaign of Daniel Evans for governor of Washington. He was assigned to spy on Democratic Party candidate Albert Rossellini and report back to Republican headquarters. When Bundy's role as a spy was discovered, it made the newspapers. Ted Bundy briefly became the center of media attention, and he reveled in it, while feigning humility, saying that he was a humble cog in the political machine. When Evans was elected, he made Bundy an assistant to the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, where Bundy developed a very favorable reputation, many useful contacts, and became a frequent dinner guest in Seattle high society. In the summer of 1973, Bundy graduated from the University of Washington with a Bachelor of Psychology and applied to law school at the University of Utah, much to the consternation of his friends and political colleagues. They were confused because Bundy was a rising star in Washington politics, not in Utah, and if he stuck around Seattle, the charismatic 26-year-old might one day be selected by the Republicans to run for political office. Bundy nevertheless claimed that he needed a change of scenery. His low LSAT scores also prevented him from applying to more prestigious universities. And perhaps given his extracurricular activities, Bundy needed to put some distance between himself and the West Coast. On June the 29th, 1973, Rita Jolly, age 17, left her home in West Lynn, Oregon, to go for an evening walk. She never returned, and her body was never found. Nearly 2 months later, on August 20th, 1973, in Eugene, Oregon, 24-year-old Vicki Lynn Holler was last seen in her car leaving work at 5 p.m. She was due to attend a party later that evening, but she never turned up. All her possessions, including her last paycheck, were left in her apartment. Vicki was known to pick up hitchhikers. Her remains have never been found. How about just leave the picking up hitchhikers to men? I don't want to sound like a sexist. Or like, don't pick up Ted Bundy. I mean, like, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying not to get myself cancelled. I don't want to say that women shouldn't pick up hitchhikers. What I do want to say is women shouldn't pick up dudes. Like, don't be driving along and be like, I'm going to pick up that guy. Just don't do that. Please don't do that. And, I don't know, my kids, my daughter, I would be like, don't go hitchhiking. Don't go hitchhiking. Go hitchhiking with a friend who's the dude. Preferably larger the better. Okay? And don't get in Ted Bundy's car. Mm-hmm.
Of course. Cancelled.
Bundy once confessed to killing 2 women in Oregon without supplying any names. In the summer of 1973, Bundy continued to be active in Republican politics, in which capacity he traveled to several states. He deferred entry into law school at the University of Utah until the following year. When on a trip to California on party business, Bundy looked up Diane Edwards. She was still single. Now that Bundy was a budding law student and a political darling in Seattle, he appeared as a much more impressive figure to Diane. The two rekindled their romance together. For the next 6 months, Diane flew up to Seattle several times to be with Ted. She fell in love with him and felt convinced that Bundy was the man she was destined to marry. For his part, Bundy did everything he could to cultivate this impression. Meanwhile, Bundy was in a relationship with Liz Klopfer. Naturally, Bundy did not tell either women that he was two-timing them. Bundy proposed to Diane Edwards in late 1973 and introduced her to a friend as his fiancée. Then in January 1974, Bundy became cold and distant towards her. Even cruel, he did not answer Diane's letters or phone calls for an entire month. When Diane finally reached Bundy by phone in February 1974, she demanded to know why I had broken things off with no explanation. Bundy replied, and we quote here, "I have no idea what you mean. and immediately slammed down the phone. Diane Edwards was devastated by this move, and she never saw or heard from Bundy again. His revenge for being rejected by Diane some 5 years earlier was complete. Dude, that is psycho. I know he's murdered people, and obviously that is worse, but holy shit, it's 5 years later, and you do this elaborate... I wouldn't be surprised if he got high in politics. He went to Utah Law School or whatever, and then went to meet her, met up with her, and did all of this. I mean, obviously he did that later part of meeting up with her and then getting in the relationship and then breaking it off because he's a psycho. But did he even... I wouldn't be surprised if he even made the effort in his personal life to be more impressive as part of some elaborate years-long scheme to just fuck with Diane Edwards, which is... That, I don't even know. Is that Machiavellian? Sort of. Is that the right use of the term? But it's just so psycho, isn't it? Jesus Christ. Now Bundy had proven he was worthy of her, he discarded her like hot trash. It is quite clear Bundy planned to do this from the start. It's likely the only reason Bundy did not murder Diane is because he would have been the prime suspect. Instead, Bundy's hatred of Diane found expression with women who resembled her in a lengthening series of atrocities. The Slaughter of 74. On the night of January the 4th, 1974, Ted Bundy broke into the bedroom of University of Washington student Karen Sparks, aged 18. He surprised her in bed and bludgeoned her unconscious with a metal rod that he tore from her bed frame. She was hit in the head so many times with the metal rod that she sustained permanent and debilitating brain injuries. Bundy then inserted the rod into Sparks' vagina so that it ruptured her reproductive organ. Jesus Christ. Caused internal bleeding and entered her lower digestive tract. Sparks was not discovered until the following afternoon, where her roommates finally investigated why she had not emerged from her bedroom. They found Sparks lying in a pool of her own blood. She spent the next 10 days in the hospital in a coma, where she miraculously survived, although she was disabled both physically and mentally for the rest of her life. That is, nothing to add. On the night of January the 31st, 1974, Bundy broke into the bedroom of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healey, another University of Washington student, who delivered the weather report for skiers on the local morning radio. He bludgeoned Healey as she slept, took off her nightgown, and dressed her in jeans and a blouse. He then removed Healey from her apartment to an unknown second location. According to Bundy, he revived Healey, forced her to undress in front of him, and then he raped and murdered her. The next day, the radio station called Linda's roommate, since she had not shown up for work, who in turn contacted Linda's parents. That evening, Linda's parents reported her missing. Police searched Linda's room and found her bed was soaked in blood, and they found a blood-stained nightgown hanging in her closet. Her decapitated skull was found the following year on Taylor Mountain, several miles east of Seattle, and a place where Ted Bundy frequently went hiking. We know that Bundy decapitated several of his victims and kept their heads for a while, applying makeup to them and shampooing their hair, kissing them, and performing necrotic fellatio until the smell of rotting flesh made the discovery of the severed heads more likely, at which point he discarded them in the remote wilderness. Dude. I know it's Ted Bundy. But it is and I know he's murdered and raped and beaten and done all this stuff, but it's did we have to throw necrophilia in there, Ted? Why?
I'm sorry, Dave. This is too much.
On March the 12th, Donna Manson, aged 19, was abducted while walking between her dorm room and a jazz concert on the Evergreen State College campus in the town of Olympia, 60 miles south of Seattle. Bundy later claimed that he incinerated her skull in the fireplace of his girlfriend, Liz Klopfer, and dumped her headless body somewhere on Taylor Mountain. If this is true, then Manson's skeleton is still out there somewhere, probably in unrecognizable bone fragments due to a half-century of interference from local wildlife. On the evening of April the 17th, this is a spree, isn't it? So many, such a short time. Bundy abducted Susan Rancourt, aged 18, from the campus of Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles south of Seattle. She was headed to a student advisors meeting, followed by a showing of a German-language film. Earlier that same evening, a student was approached by Bundy, who had his arm raised in a sling, asking her to help him carry a load of books to his tan Volkswagen Beetle. Another student reported being approached by Bundy 3 nights earlier. Susan Rancourt's decapitated skull was discovered on Taylor Mountain a year later. On May the 6th, 1974, Roberta Parks, age 22, is abducted from the campus of Oregon State University while walking from her dormitory to a cafe. Her skull was found on Taylor Mountain the following year. Later, under police interview, Bundy mocked the fact that her remains had been picked over by animals. Dude, it's fucked up. On May the 27th, Brenda Baker, a runaway aged only 14, was last seen hitchhiking 35 miles south of Seattle. Her body was found in Milsylvania State Park, a further 30 miles to the south 1 year later. On June the 1st, a mere 4 days later, Bundy lured 22-year-old Brenda Ball to his car in a parking lot of the Flame Tavern near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. He had his arm in a sling and pretended to need assistance. A skull was found on Taylor Mountain. On the night of the 11th, 18-year-old University of Washington students this is ongoing. Georgian Hawkins was leaving her boyfriend's dormitory when she was approached in an alleyway by Ted Bundy. He was in a leg cast and on crutches. He asked Hawkins to help carry a briefcase to his car. There, Bundy hit her over the head with a crowbar, handcuffed her, drove her to Issaquah, a remote area 20 miles east of Seattle, where he raped her, strangled her to death, committed acts of necrophilia, and slept the rest of the night beside her body. Bundy dumped Hawkins near a service road not far away from where he killed her. Bundy revisited her corpse 3 times, where he masturbated to the memory of her murder. The next morning, Bundy returned to the parking lot where he had abducted Hawkins and retrieved some earrings and a shoe that had fallen off in the struggle, lest it become police evidence. Due to the presence of wildlife, Jordan's femur and several vertebrae were the only parts of her body ever recovered. On July the 1st, 1974, it is possible that Bundy made a road trip to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he was soon to attend law school. Sandra Weaver was abducted there, and her naked body was discovered the next day near Grand Junction, Colorado. Some reports say that Bundy mentioned her during police interviews. Over the course of 6 brutal months, the disappearances of the young women were splashed across the newspapers, prompting a great deal of public fear and hysteria. Yeah, I'm not surprised. This is all in a very short amount of time, and it's all very violent and disturbing. Police quickly tied the Washington and Oregon disappearances to the same man, given the similarity of the victim profile and the MO. However, Bundy had left no evidence behind, and there were only scanty reports of an injured man with a brown, bronze, or tan Volkswagen Beetle. In 1974, there were some 20,000 such vehicles on the West Coast. Police combed through thousands of tips, most of them misleading, and even began considering connections to a satanic cult and even the Zodiac Killer. In truth, however, have we done the Zodiac Killer yet? I've definitely made a video about Zodiac on biographics. Again, that channel I mentioned earlier, biographies. Have we done him on Casual Criminalist? I don't think so, right? Oh gosh, we've done 100 of these now. Maybe we have. I get confused. In truth, however, Bundy's work had been so clean that the police knew they'd never catch him until he committed another murder and made a mistake. Until then, there was little to do besides busy work while police waited for Bundy to strike. On July the 14th, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, 40,000 people were enjoying the beach and summer festivities. Among them was Ted Bundy. He had his left arm in a sling. He spoke with a British accent. He approached 5 women, one at a time, introduced himself as Ted, and asked for their help in unloading a sailboat from his car due to his injured arm. 4 of the women refused. One woman, Janice Graham, went with Bundy, noticed there was no sailboat hooked up to his Beetle, and ran away. Smart woman. It's like, you don't have a sailboat. I am leaving right now, very quickly. Something's up, and we know there's a psycho around. In that situation, just call the police, just in case, be one of those tips that works out. Do that, just in case. Why not? The police aren't going to be mad. Bundy remained patient and approached Janice Ott, age 23, who agreed to help him. Bundy lured her to his car, bludgeoned her unconscious, and drove her 2 miles away, where he left Janice in the woods for nearly 4 hours, bound, gagged, unconscious, but still alive. Meanwhile, Bundy drove back to Lake Sammamish. Bundy managed to convince Denise Naslund, age 19, with the same sailboat story. Bundy bludgeoned her unconscious. He drove Naslund back to the spot where he had left Ott. Then, according to one confession, Bundy forced a now unconscious Janice to watch as he raped and strangled Denise Naslund. Bundy then raped and murdered a terrified Janice Ott. Bundy dumped their bodies near the same service road where it dumped Jordan Hawkins a few weeks before in June. Their remains were discovered 2 months later by grouse hunters in September 1974. Finally, the police had recovered some bodies, but there was very little forensic evidence on them to tie them to Bundy. It did, however, confirm that the disappearances of these women was the work of a serial killer. Meanwhile, numerous eyewitnesses at Lake Sammamish, including Janice Ott's friends, provided them with a description of the suspect. Excellent. A friendly, handsome man in a white tennis outfit with his arm in a sling who drove a Volkswagen Beetle and identified himself as Ted. Really? You've got your arm in a sling. You're speaking with a British accent, but you're like, no, I'll just use my real name. Okay. Police had no way of knowing whether this was the suspect's real name or merely a fake one. I guess that's the thing. The police would be like, you'd assume it would be fake. You'd be like, there's no way he's using a real name. No way. But they made the most of it in a case with very few leads. Police publicized the name in the hopes of gathering information and circulated a police sketch of the man in question. Liz Klopfer, Bundy's regular girlfriend, recognized him from the police sketch. Whoa! And the fact that the suspect identified himself as Ted and drove a Beetle. This is so sloppy. Bundy had told Liz that he was going to Lake Sammamish that day to go water skiing. Liz had also begun to be alarmed by some of Bundy's erratic and secretive behavior, disappearing for hours at a time, sometimes in the middle of the night. Liz duly phoned in an anonymous tip to the police. At that point, the police were receiving over 200 tips a day. They were also mistakenly looking for the driver of a bronze or dark brown Volkswagen at the time, rather than the light tan one. After eventually looking into Ted Bundy's background, a politically connected law student with no criminal record, they eliminated him from their inquiries. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of evidence to go on, and it seems like, well, they shouldn't eliminate him, but he doesn't have a criminal record. He doesn't, or it must have been expunged or whatever. But can't they see that it's been expunged or something? Because it doesn't. I know. I'm pretty forgiving of this. I think this is not unreasonable to be like, okay, he's not our dude, because they also got the details of the car wrong. But his girlfriend recognizing it is just a bit much. Oh, I don't know. They even interviewed him. When Liz phoned again and learned police had struck Bundy from the suspect list, she heaved a great sigh of relief and convinced herself that all of her suspicions had just been in her head. In August 1974, Bundy started at law school at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Klopfer stayed behind in Seattle with her daughter Molly. Needless to say, while in Utah, Bundy cheated on her with at least a dozen other women. Reportedly, Bundy struggled with his law classes. Also, the University of Utah was not the Ivy League pipe and elbow patches sort of university that he imagined attending. It was a modernizing university with disgusting post-war architecture and fewer pretensions of grandeur. This did not feed Bundy's ego at all, and he soon lost interest in his studies. On September the 2nd, Bundy picked up a female hitchhiker from Idaho in his Volkswagen Beetle, raped and strangled her. He dumped her body in a nearby river. She was never identified, and the body was never found. On October the 2nd, Bundy abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in a suburb of Salt Lake City. Bundy later claimed that he buried her body in Capitol Reef National Park, 200 miles to the south, but her remains have never been found. On the evening of October the 18th, 1974, Melissa Smith, age 17, left a Salt Lake City pizza parlor after consoling a friend who had broken up with her boyfriend. Melissa was headed to a slumber party. Bundy abducted her, bludgeoned her, raped her, sodomized her, and then strangled her with a nylon stocking. There is some indication that Bundy kept Smith alive for several days before he murdered her. Bundy then dumped her naked body in the Wasatch Mountains, where she was discovered 9 days later. Her father, Lewis Smith, the local police chief, tried to remain stoic, but he was clearly devastated by Melissa's death. He vowed to find her killer, so that no young girl would have a similar fate. Sadly, though, that was not to be. Just past midnight on October the 31st, 17-year-old Laura Aim was abducted shortly after leaving a cafe while on her way home from a Halloween party. Bundy beat, raped, and strangled her. He also spent several days with the corpse, shampooing her hair and applying makeup. Bundy later said, quote, "If you've got time, they can be anything you want them to be." He engaged in multiple acts of necrophilia over multiple days before the rotting smell of the body forced him to stop. Laura's body was found by hikers in American Fork Canyon a few weeks later. At this point, police in Washington heard news of the Utah murders. The similarities were quite striking. Given the identical MO and the reports of a man feigning injury with a tan Beetle, authorities concluded that the Ted from Lake Sammamish was responsible. However, the exchange of information between police took time. Conversations were held over the telephone. Case files were sent through the ordinary mail. There was no internet in 1974. People didn't even have fax machines. As Detective Keppel of the Washington Task Force said, quote, "It took my partner and I a year and a half to collect information on over 90 murders in the western states. If everybody cooperated in a centralized database and submitted their crimes, it would have been a matter of seconds." Meanwhile, Bundy's name was buried under a mountain of other potential suspects and misleading tips. And worse, he had already been investigated and largely ruled out. Fucking kill me then. On the evening of November the 8th, 1974, 18-year-old telephone operator Carol DeRanch was shopping at the Fashion Place Mall in Salt Lake City when she was approached by Ted Bundy. He identified himself as Officer Roseland and told her the man was seen breaking into her car. Bundy accompanied Carol outside to her vehicle where everything seemed in order and there were no signs of forced entry. Bundy requested that Carol look inside her car and check that nothing was stolen. She opened the door of her car and glanced at her possessions. She said that everything was there. Bundy insisted that Carol lean down and look harder just to be sure. At this point, Carol got a little bit weirded out. Bundy was not dressed like a policeman, and she thought she could smell alcohol on his breath. Carol asked to see some ID. Bundy flashed a fake police badge, which mollified Carol's suspicions. Never be, always, if there's a policeman, he says a policeman, ask for ID. It's no problem, it's fine. It's like, just ask. You got nothing to lose. Any suspicion, just ask. And if they flash it, look, it'd be like, no, I'd like to see that properly, please. Where was it? There was someone who came to my house, like, to check the gas or something. And they're, oh yeah, I'm here to check the gas. And I'm like, bro, what's going on? You can't just, and then they always like make a move to come into your house. It's like, okay, well, I need some ID. And he's like, oh, okay, here you go, here's some ID. And then he's like, come on. And I'm like, give me a second. It's like, it's fine. Like, and like 99.9% of the time, they're going to be the gas man, they're going to be a cop, all of this stuff. But like 0.1% of the time, they're going to murder you.
We'll be prepared, waiting.
So, lesson. Look at the ID. Bundy then requested that Carol accompany him to a nearby police station to fill out a witness report. Against her better judgment, Carol followed Bundy to his car, which she saw was a tan Volkswagen Beetle. Carol brushed this off as Bundy being undercover. Oh God, why would he be undercover? Well, he's like not doing some sort of genius like drug undercover thing. He's walking around a parking lot making sure cars aren't broken into. It sounds like he's actually a security guard. And you know what security guards don't do? Go undercover. They took off together and Bundy started driving in the opposite direction of the police. Oh my God. This has got to be so intense. Opposite direction of the police station. When Carol pointed this out, Bundy pulled into the parking lot of a local school. It was the early evening and everyone had gone home. Bundy handcuffed one of Carol's wrists. She screamed. Bundy pointed a gun at her and said he'd blow her brains out if she didn't shut up. But realizing compliance would probably mean death anyway, Carol thought, well, fucking kill me then. And she began to struggle violently, breaking her fingernails on both hands in the process. In the confusion, Bundy clasped the second handcuff on the same arm as he did the first one. That's a big brain move. Oh no, that's the same arm. It's just jewelry now. Stripped of any way of binding her, Bundy grappled with Carol and tried to knock her out, being unwilling to shoot her in his car with all the attention that would draw, both from the noise and the resulting mess. However, Carol managed to get the car door open and clambered out. Bundy also leapt out of the vehicle, crowbar at the ready. Bundy pressed Carol back up against the car and held her there. But Carol kicked Bundy in the balls and escaped, running down the road until she was able to flag down a passing vehicle. She leapt inside and demanded that they take her to the police station. Bundy recovered from the blow to his genitals and quickly fled the scene. This has got to be it, right? This has got to be where they finally close in on him, because he's not been wearing a mask or anything, and he's in the tan Beetle. This is it. Come on, let's go. Carol Durant arrived at the police station, the handcuffs still dangling from her arm, and filed a police report against the so-called Officer Roseland. The police are going to be like, yeah, no one's called Officer Roseland, sorry. Police sent a squad car to where Carol had escaped, but to no avail. They got a description of Bundy from Carol, took several of Bundy's hairs off her jacket, and retrieved a sample of some of Bundy's blood, which had stained Carol's jacket when she scratched him. The blood was determined to be type O. Bundy was furious and humiliated. This was the first time his prey had escaped him. An hour after Carol kicked Bundy in the balls, he arrived at Viewmont High School 20 miles away. The students were putting on a play at the school that evening. Bundy approached the school's young drama teacher and asked her to come outside to identify a car parked there. She told him she was busy as the play was about to begin. Bundy tried the same thing with a female student, but she refused. Bundy was spotted by another student pacing back and forth at the back of the auditorium during the play. Partway through the performance, 17-year-old high school student Deborah Kent, who was watching the play with her parents, left to pick up her brother from a local bowling alley. She then planned to return to drive her parents home. Bundy intercepted Deborah in the parking lot, bludgeoned her unconscious, and threw her in his car. A witness saw a tan Volkswagen Beetle speeding away from the scene. Later, police found a handcuff key in the parking lot which matched the one that Bundy had placed on Carol Durant's arm, linking the two incidents to the same suspect. Deborah Kent's body was dumped 100 miles south near Fairview, Utah. When police searched the area, all they found was one of her kneecaps. It was confirmed to be Deborah's decades later in 2015 via DNA testing. After the catastrophes of that evening, Bundy halted his activities in Utah for a while. Back in Seattle, Liz Klopfer, who was still in a long-distance relationship with Bundy, heard reports that young women were disappearing in Utah. Her memories of the unknown Ted and his Volkswagen Beetle from Lake Sammamish last July came flooding back to her. Now Bundy was in Utah, and all too coincidentally, women were dropping like flies. Klopfer called the police and was interviewed about her suspicions. Seattle police put Bundy's picture in a photo lineup, but Lake Sammamish witnesses failed to identify him. But Klopfer couldn't rest easy. In December, she called Salt Lake City police. They added Bundy to their list of suspects. Shit, I really thought this would be when they get him. Like, they'd have enough, the car, this is like back in the day. There wouldn't be like security footage at this shopping mall or wherever it was, where the woman had the car in the parking lots. The past sucked. A looming shadow grows. In early January 1975, his appetites overwhelming him, Bundy drove to Aspen, Colorado, ostensibly to do a little skiing. On January the 12th, Bundy abducted Karen Campbell at the Wildwood Inn while she was walking from the elevator to her room to retrieve a magazine. He bludgeoned Karen, raped her, and made several incisions on her body with a knife. Her naked corpse was found the following month in a snowbank next to a dirt road not far from the hotel. Karen's skull had been fractured, and the blows were so violent that they rattled one of her teeth loose from her gums. It hung there by the root. She was murdered within 2 hours of her disappearance. Bundy returned to Seattle to spend time with Liz Klopfer and daughter Molly, whom he was still sexually molesting. Liz did not mention to Bundy that she had reported him to the police multiple times and gotten him added to the list of suspects in both Washington and Utah. Bundy, in turn, did not mention to Liz that he was slaying a bunch of innocent women and that he was carrying on multiple affairs with other girls back in Utah. It's some pretty big secrets in that relationship, aren't there? Jesus. A couple of months later, Bundy again made a trip to the Colorado mountains. On March the 15th, he approached a local ski instructor named Julie Cunningham, age 26. Bundy hobbled up to her on crutches, asking her to help carry his ski boots to his car. Bundy knocked Julie out, cuffed her, transported her to a second location 90 miles away. Her remains were never found. However, Bundy later confessed that at the start of April 1975, he paid a return visit to Colorado to look at her body. He hobbled up to her on crutches carrying ski boots. Oh, I guess he could have injured himself while skiing or something. That kind of makes sense. But I'd be like, how are you going to ski? While heading back to Colorado on April the 6th, Bundy stopped by Grand Junction near the state border. There he abducted 25-year-old Denise Oliverson while she was riding her bike to her parents' house. Her body was never found, but her bicycle and shoes were found under a nearby railroad bridge. On April the 15th, still in Colorado, Bundy kidnapped Susan Cooley, age 18, from a high school in the town of Nederland. He bludgeoned her, raped her, strangled her. Her body was discovered 2 weeks later in Coal Creek Canyon, 20 miles away. On May the 6th, Bundy traveled into Idaho and abducted 12-year-old Lynette Culver from her school in Pocatello. He transported Lynette back to his hotel room, where he raped her and drowned her in the bathtub. He wrapped the child's body and dumped Lynette in Snake River. Once again, the body was never found. It's not bad enough. Why do we always have to go down this path? Well, that's because it's a true crime show, isn't it? But it's like, oh yeah, okay, some murder. Okay, some necrophilia. Okay, child murder and rape. Jesus. Back in Salt Lake City, on the 16th of May, 3 of Bundy's former co-workers came to visit him. One of them was Carol Ann Boone, with whom Bundy had periodically been having sex behind Liz's back. Boone, twice divorced and raising a son, was already in love with Bundy. He did not disclose to Boone that he was also having it away with a fellow Utah law student at the time. At the start of June, Bundy spent a week in Seattle with Liz and Molly. Bundy floated the idea that they get married on Christmas Day. Returning to Salt Lake City, Bundy figured he was in the clear for the botched kidnapping of Carol DeRonch. It had been 8 months, and the police had not come sniffing around. He felt safe enough to renew his activities in Utah while keeping up his activities across state lines. It's amazing how much crime he is committing and just not getting caught. It's just staggering amounts and violent, the worst types of crimes.
I can't do this. I can't do this anymore.
On June the 28th, Bundy murdered Susan Curtis, aged 15, while she was attending a youth conference at Brigham Young University, 43 miles south of Salt Lake City. Her body was never found. Mere days later, on July the 1st, Bundy abducted 24-year-old Shelley Robertson in the town of Golden, Colorado. Her body was found inside a mine shaft in Berthoud Pass. On the 4th of July, 3 days later, Nancy Bard was abducted from the gas station she worked at in Layton, Utah. Her body was never found. Layton is approximately 25 miles north of Salt Lake City. In August 1975, Ted Bundy became a member of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormonism, and he was well liked by his fellow parishioners. Bundy's intention was to enhance his social standing in Utah and perhaps even make a political bid for the state instead of Washington. From there, he would run for governor or senator and eventually US president. Bro, like, what? You're a serial killer. Do you really want to be attracting that sort of attention to yourself? Because there are people, if you're running for president, or someone's gonna dig this up, my dude. You're so fucked. You can't think that that's really something you're gonna be able to do and get away with it. Do you? Am I being naive here? It sounds like I'm being a bit naive. But I kind of feel like you've killed multiple people. They're gonna look into you and they're gonna find this. And they're gonna be like, turns out the president is a serial killer. Oh my.
This is America!
What is he doing?
Meanwhile, Washington police had refined their list of suspects for slaughter of 74 to roughly 100 people. Thanks to Liz Klopfer, Bundy was increasingly coming to the top of that list. And then came the moment the police had been waiting for. Bundy fucked up. Icarus. On the 16th of August, 1975, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Bundy was cruising the streets of Salt Lake City looking for another victim. Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward spotted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle. He did not recognize it from the neighborhood and thought that Bundy was driving erratically. Officer Hayward lit up his lights and signaled for Bundy to pull over, suspecting a standard DUI, but Bundy had his kill kit with him, and he couldn't afford to be stopped. Uh-oh. Bundy switched off his lights, put his foot on the gas, and led Hayward on a high-speed chase through Salt Lake City in the suburb of Granger. When Hayward finally managed to force the Beetle to pull over at a gas station, he made a rather startling discovery. The passenger seat had been removed. Unbeknownst to Officer Hayward, this was so that Bundy could lay down the unconscious body of a woman on the floor. Upon searching the car, Hayward found a ski mask, a strip of pantyhose with the eyes cut out, a crowbar, handcuffs, garbage bags, rope, and an ice pick. At that point, I'll be like, I'm going to need some more officers to come to where I am immediately. Please bring the big guns. Bundy was arrested on suspicion of burglary. Bro, he's got garbage bags, rope, and an ice pick, and handcuffs. He ain't Robin, is he? Bundy's car and physical description matched the details of the attempted kidnapping of Carol DeRonch 9 months earlier. Bundy was also on the list of suspects for slaying women in Utah and Washington state, thanks to Liz Klopfer's multiple phone calls to the police. Bundy was held in prison while a search warrant of his apartment was conducted. There, the police found a pamphlet on Colorado ski results and a check mark next to it on the blurb of the Wildwood Inn, where Karen Campbell had been abducted and murdered. They also found a pamphlet advertising a play at Viewmont High School on November the 8th, the night Deborah Kent had been abducted. Dude, don't keep souvenirs from your crimes. This is one of the rules. Come on now. Additionally, the handcuffs found in Bundy's car were of the same make and brands that had been used against both Carol DeRonch and Deborah Kent. Unfortunately, this was insufficient evidence to hold Bundy without bail, and so he was released pending investigation. Yeah, it's so circumstantial. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy under 24-hour surveillance. Salt Lake police sent 2 investigators to go to Seattle and interview Liz Klopfer. She came to the King County Police Station on September the 16th and spent several hours giving an exhaustive interview to both Utah and Washington state authorities. First and foremost, Liz could not account for Bundy's whereabouts on the nights of any of the murders during the slaughter of 74 when Bundy was still living with her, and she claimed Bundy was water skiing at Lake Sammamish the day that Ott and Naslund were killed. This is it, man. This is it. This is game over, right? We're only about 17 pages into this 30-page script, but it's got to be like trial, execution, right? Please, no more. Oh, we know he escapes from prison, don't we? How do you escape from prison when you've gone to prison for this kind of stuff? I feel like they should put you in like terrorist prison, like where the Boston bomber and Ted Kaczynski are, ADX Florence, right? Put them in there. In those rooms that they can lay for like an hour a day to stand in a bit patch of dirt with a wall all around them and a guy with a big gun just constantly pointing at them, being like, don't try anything, Ted. Oh, look, Ted Kaczynski. Ted Bundy. Maybe I don't like the name Ted.
It's ruined.
From there, her accounts of Bundy's domestic behavior grew increasingly alarming. Liz said that Bundy would often sleep during the day and go out at night. She also said that Bundy had little interest in sex with her unless she allowed him to perform BDSM acts on her. Some nights she awoke to find Bundy under the covers with a flashlight examining her body. Liz also spotted Bundy on several occasions making plaster of Paris casts for his arms and legs using powder that he stole from a medical supply store, though he never sustained any sort of injury to his limbs. He also inexplicably kept a pair of crutches. In fact, over the years, she discovered a number of unusual objects in Bundy's possession. He had a hatchet, despite never having to chop any firewood or any such thing. He also had a meat cleaver that he never used for cooking, a box of disposable surgical gloves, a knife in a wooden case, a heavy lug wrench that he stashed in her car and periodically took out for quote-unquote security on his nightly drives, and a big bag full of women's clothes and jewelry. Liz also suspected that he had stolen most of his possessions, including his TV and stereo, and when she confronted him about this, Bundy had threatened to, quote, break her fucking neck.
Which is, of course, what Ted Bundy would say.
If you're the wife of someone and you discover all this shit in the garage, be like, why is there all this murder equipment and women's clothes in these bags in the garage? Then don't confront your husbands. Just go to the police. And maybe there's an innocent explanation, but maybe there's not. And you're living with a serial killer. That would be intense. In order to get a measure of the man, police contacted Diane Edwards, Bundy's girlfriend, prior to Liz Klopfer. They discovered that Bundy had not stayed away from Diane after 1968, but instead had rekindled their relationship in 1973, while he was also seeing Liz. Diane recounted how they had even got engaged around Christmas until the start of 1974, when Bundy had cut off all contact. While Bundy was not the first man to two-time his girlfriend, the end of Diane and Bundy's relationship coincided with the start of the slaughter of 74. And police were also immediately struck by the fact that Diane was brunette with long hair parted down the middle, just like many of the victims. Similarly, Liz Klopfer kept her hair long and parted down the middle, and she reported that Bundy got extremely angry when she'd entertained the idea of cutting it. In September 1975, Bundy sold his Beetle to a teenager in an attempt to get some distance between him and the evidence. Mate, it is a bit late for that shit. The plan completely backfired. Utah police impounded the vehicle and it was torn to pieces in a forensic search. Police discovered hairs that matched Melissa Smith, the police chief's daughter, had been killed in October 1974. Carol DeRonch, who Bundy had attempted to kidnap in November of that year, and Karen Campbell, who had been murdered in Aspen at the start of 1975. From this point forward, the police knew they had their man. Now they just had to prove it in a court of law. There's so much evidence. Surely it's not going to be that difficult. I mean, I know this is pre-DNA, but still, come on, lock it down. And also, bring him back in. Get him into custody and don't give him any bail. Put him in a very dark room and leave him there. And hopefully he'll never leave, even though we know he does, because we know he escapes and then he goes murdering. So that's brilliant. Let's carry on. On October the 2nd, police arranged for Carol DeRonch to come in and identify Bundy as the man who had tried to abduct her. Bundy, who had worn his hair long and shaggy over his ears during the kidnapping, abruptly cut it all off to alter his appearance. The police had to eject the people they had gathered for the lineup and rapidly scrambled to find men with short hair to replace them. They wound up using officers from the station. Again, Bundy's cunning plan backfired. He was lined up with men who looked nothing like him. Carol DeRonch identified without hesitation Ted Bundy as the so-called Officer Rosalind, who had approached her at the mall the previous year. I feel like that's a lineup that is going to get absolutely roasted in court, though, because they'll be like, you can't just use random police officers. You need people who look sort of like the person, no? Similarly, the drama teacher from Viewmont High School identified Bundy as the creep who had been lurking around the auditorium that night. But because Deborah Kent's body had not yet been found, only a kneecap ever would be, and it would only be matched to DNA 40 years later, police did not have enough evidence to charge Bundy with Kent's murder. However, they did charge Bundy with the attempted kidnapping of Carol DeRonch. The judge set Bundy's bail at $15,000 or $80,000 in today's money. Bundy called his parents to borrow the cash. Louise Bundy was certain of his innocence. Why are you giving him bail at all? What are you up to? This is crazy talk. He's accused of the multiple rapes and murders. That shouldn't be a bail situation, my guys. American justice system, what the fuck's going on? His fellow members of the Mormon church were outraged that Bundy had been charged and rallied behind him, holding a few protests and staging charity events proclaiming his innocence. Accounts from Bundy's friends and associates either depicted him as a charming man who wouldn't harm a fly, or a liar and a creep who obviously had something wrong with him. While he awaited trial, Bundy withdrew from Utah and went back to Seattle, where Liz Klopfer inexplicably let him stay in her house. It was at this point that Bundy's narcissism and his delusional self-confidence went into the stratosphere at precisely the same moment his entire world was falling apart. Delusion was the only way that Bundy could cope. In the press, Bundy laughingly declared that he would defeat the charges against him and clear his name. He also vowed to finish his law degree and become a good trial lawyer, using his current defense team as a shining example. It's quite clear that Bundy thought he could shake the kidnapping charge and go right back to the way things were. He did not seem to realize that DeRonch was only the first hurdle and that the police were looking at him for dozens of murders. Conversely, the police thought they had Bundy cornered with the evidence for several of his crimes. What they didn't realize is that there is seldom anything more dangerous than a psychopath who has been backed into a corner and feels that he has nothing left to lose. Yeah, but what's he gonna do? What's he possibly gonna do? He's fucked. The caged animal. Bundy spent an uneasy Christmas and New Year preparing for the DeRonch trial. According to one of Bundy's later confessions, at the start of February 1976, just before the trial was due to begin, he abducted 17-year-old Debbie Smith in Salt Lake City. Her badly decomposed body was found 2 months later, on April the 1st, lying in a wooded area near the Salt Lake City airport. By this point, Bundy had murdered approximately 31 women, though the number may be much higher. The DeRonch trial began on February the 23rd, 1976. The press in Utah and across the United States not only connected Bundy to the botched kidnapping, but to a series of murders that occurred in several western states over the past 2 years. As such, Bundy's reputation was not exactly soaring high. He therefore waived his right to a jury trial, doubting he could find impartial jurors, and left his fate in the hands of the judge. Bold move. Bold move. Judgy is going to be able to see through your charming ways. Like, you might be able to, charm a jury, or some members of a jury, or maybe enough to get off. But a judge is going to be like, dude, I know what you're doing. I see through your bullshit. I know you're a serial killer. You're getting the gas chamber or whatever they do to people. Bundy was relaxed and cocky in the courtroom, and he looked up case law and assisted his defense team. With a smirk on his face, Bundy claimed he had never seen DeRonch before, but he was unable to provide an alibi for the time of the attack. Carol DeRonch took the stand for hours, being constantly probed about her identification of Bundy as Officer Roseland. She did not waver. Bundy later said that he was beside himself with rage when she pointed him out to the judge. He stood up and shouted, quote, "She's lying. She lied before. She's lying now." After a 4-day trial and a weekend of deliberation, the judge found Bundy guilty of attempted kidnapping and assault. The judge ordered he be sent to a Utah prison for a 90-day psychiatric evaluation. This was to determine whether Bundy should be given a jail sentence or be put on probation for the crime. Attempted kidnapping? Probation?
What is going on here?
In the end, the prison psychiatrist found that Bundy represented a continuing danger to society, smart guy, and recommended against probation. In June 1976, Bundy was sentenced to prison for 1 to 15 years, pending a more positive psychiatric evaluation that would secure his release. Uh-oh. He's gonna rig that, because he's a psycho.
He's not a psychologist.
He's gonna learn what he needs to do, and then he's gonna do it, and he's gonna get out. Upon his conviction, the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City excommunicated him, and all their talk of Bundy's innocence abruptly stopped. In October 1976, Bundy was caught hiding in the bushes of the prison yard, carrying road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card. He was locked in solitary confinement for several weeks as a result. Where'd you get all that shit?
I understand you're a man that knows how to get things.
It's amazing what people smuggle into prisons. That same month, Bundy was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell in Aspen, Colorado in January 1975. She was the woman whom Bundy had grabbed when she was walking from the elevator to her hotel room at the Wildwood Inn. For evidence, the Colorado authorities had the brochure from the Wildwood Inn found in Bundy's Utah apartment and gas slips that placed Bundy in Aspen around the time of Campbell's murder. A witness came forward, saying that they'd seen Bundy in the elevator of the Wildwood Inn the same day as Campbell's abduction. Hairs had been found in Bundy's beetle that matched Campbell, and dents in her skull vaguely matched the crowbar that Bundy had in his possession. The hairs in the car, that's gotta lock it in, right? The other stuff's circumstantial, even though we know it's him. But the hairs in the car, how else did they get there, Ted? How else did they get there? Come on. It's time for you to die. Bundy initially fought extradition to Colorado, since if convicted he would have to face the death penalty, but in January 1977 he allowed himself to go to Colorado, confident that he could win. He was held in Garfield County Jail, an old-fashioned 16-cell jailhouse from the days of the Wild West. Bundy decided to serve as his own lawyer, joining his defense team. One of Bundy's other defense attorneys described pre-trial conversations with him as egocentric, vapid, and devoid of any content. Bundy gave a lot of self-indulgent press interviews where he smiled winningly and proclaimed his innocence. One press member asked Bundy, quote, "Do you ever think you're getting out of here?" To which Bundy paused, thought for a second, and then replied with a boyish grin, "Well, Legally, sure. Meanwhile, Bundy spent weeks repeatedly jumping off the top bunk of his cell in Garfield County Jail in order to strengthen his legs to resist the impact of any great fall. He practiced rapidly changing his clothes. He measured the distance from the courthouse to the alleyway and ran that same distance back and forth in his cell. Bundy also got a haircut again to change his appearance. Why is Bundy up to all these weird activities? Could he be possibly planning an escape? Maybe? Why does he keep jumping off his... Can you strengthen your legs like that? Is that a thing? On June the 7th, 1977, he was transferred to Pitkin County Courthouse for the preliminary hearing. Because Bundy was acting as his own lawyer, he was not wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. Oh no, is this how he escapes? He was also permitted to use the courthouse's law library to conduct research. Oh, now I remember. He jumps out the window of the law library, doesn't he? The guard stood outside the library while Bundy opened the second-story window and jumped down 25 feet, landing on the ground, spraining his right ankle. That is fucking high. Bundy ripped off the outer layer of his clothing to reduce the risk of being identified and made a run toward Aspen Mountain. He broke into an unoccupied cabin, ate some canned food, found a change of clothes and a rifle. He spent the night of the 7th in the cabin while police set up roadblocks in and out of Aspen, and a team of 150 men looked frantically for him. The next day, Bundy got lost and spent the next 2 days wandering in the wilderness. He was hit by a downpour of rain and sleet, which sent him into a state of shock. On June the 10th, he stole food and a parka from a camping trailer and headed back toward Aspen. 3 days later, on June the 13th, Bundy walked back into town, stole a car from the Aspen golf course, and tried to drive out of the area. Policemen spotted Bundy driving erratically about 8 miles out of town, pulled him over, and arrested him. Bundy was returned to the courthouse 20 pounds lighter, with blisters covering his feet and smiling like a madman, reveling in all the media attention. I can't believe, after all of that effort, to escape from prison, training his legs, doing the running, thinking about it, getting everything perfect, dropping down 25 feet. And he's like, I just got lost in the woods and got really cold. Dude, what are you up to? You put so much attention into this. The trial preliminaries for the murder of Karen Campbell dragged on for months, with further charges laid on Bundy for escaping. Numerous pieces of key evidence were deemed inadmissible, and Bundy's chances of acquittal for the murder were actually looking quite good. But that wasn't enough for Bundy, who thought he was a step of everybody else and wanted to prove it. Bundy somehow acquired the blueprints to the Garfield County Jail and a hacksaw, along with $500 in cash, probably courtesy of Carol Ann Boone, who was visiting him regularly. On the night of December the 30th, 1977, Bundy sawed a 1 square foot hole in the ceiling of his cell. It lost 35 pounds to be thin enough to wriggle through it. From there, he crawled across the ceiling and into the apartment of a jail guard, where he stole some clothes and walked out the front door of the prison. Then Bundy stole a car, drove it until the car broke down on the highway, whereupon Bundy hitchhiked to the nearest town and got a bus to Denver, Colorado. The next morning, he boarded a flight to Chicago. He escaped from jail twice. Guys, put him in a proper cell. At noon on December the 31st, a guard came by Bundy's cell to check on him. He thought he saw the outline of the inmate under the covers of his bunk. The guard saw that Bundy had not eaten his dinner from the night before. Pulling back the blankets on Bundy's bed, the guard discovered nothing but a big pile of books. By that point, the monster, cloaked in human skin, was already halfway across the country. America's Most Wanted. The escape of Ted Bundy hurled the entire nation into sheer, unadulterated panic. Police in Utah and Washington State feared he'd come back to wreak his revenge on former witnesses and informants. But perhaps more frightening was the thought that Bundy would simply never be caught. Corpses just start popping up across the country. Accordingly, the FBI placed Ted Bundy on their top 10 most wanted. But in the days before the internet and close interstate coordination of police forces, the FBI's efforts were limited. And unfortunately, it wasn't long before corpses did start appearing. Bundy took a train from Chicago to Ann Arbor in Michigan, where on January the 2nd, 1978, he hung out in a bar and watched a football team from the University of Washington play against the University of Michigan, and he nearly got the shit kicked out of him for supporting the visiting team. He then stole a car and drove to Atlanta, Georgia, where he got on a bus to Tallahassee, Florida, arriving on January the 8th. A few days later, on January the 15th, Bundy murdered 2 women and injured 2 others in the Cuyahoga attack, and the same night assaulted Cheryl Thomas in her basement apartment. So that's where we had the cold open for today's episode. Bundy lingered in Tallahassee for a couple of weeks. Then, on February the 8th, he stole a white van and drove 150 miles to Jacksonville. There he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter in a parking lot, claiming to be named Richard Burton and working for the Jacksonville Fire Department. Leslie was saved when her older brother arrived and scared Bundy off. Excellent. That same day, Bundy drove a further 60 miles to Lake City. He spent the night at a Holiday Inn, sipping gin and chatting with people at the bar. The next morning, on February the 9th, Bundy pulled into a junior high school and abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Bundy raped her and slit her throat. Her body was found 7 weeks later on April the 12th, 35 miles away next to a hog shed in Suwannee River State Park. By this point, Bundy's known kill count had risen to approximately 34 young women and girls. The figure is probably much higher. Bundy returned to his apartment in Tallahassee. On February the 12th, his landlord was getting angry about his overdue rent, and so Bundy stole a car, a Volkswagen Beetle, and skipped town. 3 days later, at 1 a.m. on February the 15th, near Pensacola, patrolman David Lee saw the Beetle and ran the plates and found out that it had been reported stolen. Lee signaled for Bundy to pull over. After initially trying to flee, Bundy stopped the car. Lee ordered Bundy to step out of the vehicle, lay down on the ground, and put his hands behind his back. Lee then walked over to cuff him. And look, I know, before the internet, the top 10 most wanted or whatever is not, so easy to access. But if you're a police officer, I just imagine they have those 10 dudes, pinned up on a board somewhere, right? And they'll just be vaguely looking at them every day. And then they'll be like, wait a minute. This is the guy. Suddenly, Bundy rolled over and kicked the officer in the legs, knocking him over. Bundy got up and ran for it. Lee fired 2 warning shots and then gave chase. He tackled Bundy to the ground. The two struggled for a moment over the officer's gun until Lee finally managed to overpower Bundy and strike him in the head with his revolver. Lee arrested him and threw him in the back of his police cruiser. When Lee searched the stolen Beetle, he found 3 ID cards belonging to female Florida State University students, 21 stolen credit cards, and what turned out to be a fake driver's license. Bundy refused to reveal his true identity. Lee had no idea whom he had just captured. As Lee drove Bundy to the station, Bundy muttered, quote, "I wish you had killed me. Don't we all, Ted? Don't we all?" Meet Sheriff Katsaris. While in police custody in Pensacola, Bundy claimed to be a law student at Florida State University in Tallahassee. He initially refused to give his name. Bundy resisted letting his face be shown on news cameras that had shown up to film the mystery man. Bundy had also grown a long and threadbare mustache and imprinted a fake birthmark on his left cheek in order to prevent people from recognizing him from news stories coming out of Colorado. Eventually, Bundy told the police his name was Kenneth Meisner and showed them a driver's license to prove it. Licenses didn't have pictures on them in those days. It's amazing. The past. When his name hit the headlines, a startled Kenneth Meisner contacted Pensacola police and said that he was still in Tallahassee and that his license had been stolen. At his initial arraignment, Bundy still refused to reveal his identity. As such, the judge refused him bail. If Kevin Meisner had not called and the authorities had accepted Bundy's story, he may well have been released, which is insane. You found him with people's IDs and credit cards in the back of a car. I mean, I guess that could just be theft. So, okay, give him some bail. But it's also Ted Bundy, isn't it? Meanwhile, Bundy's vehicle was determined to have been stolen in Tallahassee near the Chi Omega sorority house. Leon County Sheriff Ken Katsaris pricked his ears up when he found out, thinking that after a month it alighted on his first potential suspect. Katsaris sent a couple of burly-looking investigators out to Pensacola who started to lean on Bundy in interrogations hard, and they didn't let up. Let's just say Florida cops in the 1970s had a certain vigor when it came to interrogations. And look, no one I'm all against that, because it's let's not do that, cops. Let's not do that. But in Ted Bundy's case, it's yeah, smack him around a little. Eventually, Bundy cracked and said that he needed to talk to someone who wasn't a police officer to calm him down, and in exchange for a phone call, Bundy offered to identify himself. Pensacola police discovered to their shock they were holding Ted Bundy. He then called his girlfriend, Liz Klopfer. Over the course of 2 telephone conversations, Bundy refused to talk specifics about any of the murders since the police were listening. But when Liz asked him if he was mentally ill, Bundy replied that he was consumed by something he didn't understand and just couldn't contain. After being together for nearly a decade, these might be the most honest words that Bundy ever said to her. Katsaris used the stolen credit cards to track Bundy down to Sherrod's bar near the Chi Omega sorority house. He then found Bundy's boarding house, where the landlord and a girl who lived across the hall identified him. Meanwhile, the police tracked down one of the stolen credit cards to the Holiday Inn in Lake City, where Bundy spent the night on February the 8th, 2.5 miles from where 12-year-old Kim Leach had been abducted the following morning. Bundy was identified by people working in the hotel bar. Dude. I mean, you already were being charged or in prison or whatever it was when he escaped for major shit, and trying to escape once. this is it, man. You're never getting out of prison. Other than if you escape prison again, but I think they're going to be a little bit more cautious, you know? Fool me once, fool me 3 times. In 1978, when Katsaris confronted him about the mounting evidence for the Chi Omega murders, Bundy replied, quote, "When you find the man who actually did this, you'll be looking for a man wanted for murder in 3 digits in 6 states." Tallahassee and Lake City police decided that Bundy should be tried for the Chi Omega murders first, since Tallahassee had a much more secure jail. Good idea. And I don't like the idea that there's an insecure jail, although Ted Bundy has proven that, yeah, you can escape. I always think, you know, Prison Break is like for Michael Scofield in TV shows. In real life, it's just people, like, they jump over a fence or whatever, and then they get caught like a day later. Apparently there is also, like, escaping from jail in real life. Sheriff Katsaris kept Bundy in a secure cell with 2 extra padlocks thrown on for good measure. Katsaris took great pleasure in telling Bundy, quote, "Welcome back to Tallahassee. Get comfortable. You aren't going anywhere." One night, Katsaris arrived at Bundy's cell and told him to get up. They were going for a little ride. Bundy panicked, thinking Katsaris was going to take him out to the swamp and kill him. Instead, Katsaris took Bundy to a building where 3 dentists were waiting to take impressions of Bundy's teeth in order to match them to bite marks left on the body of Lisa Levy at Chi Omega. Katsaris had kept the purpose of the trip quiet to the last moment, so Bundy couldn't smash his teeth or chip them beyond recognition by biting into a wall. Bundy was indicted for the murders of Margaret Bauman and Lisa Levy on the 7th of July 1978. Katsaris marched Bundy out of his cell in front of waiting news cameras to read the indictment. Bundy, the pathological narcissist, was humiliated. He was furious that he was not permitted to make a public statement of his own. Bundy was indicted for the murder of Kim Leach 16 days later. Trial by farce. After a year of preparation, the preliminaries of the Chi Omega trial began on May the 9th, 1979, with Judge Edward Cowart presiding. Since Bundy had no money, he was assigned public defenders for his defense team. One of them was Michael Minerva. Due to the fact that the media had thoroughly vilified Bundy across the country, Minerva's advice to his client was to keep a low profile at the trial and not draw attention to himself in front of the jury, or in Minerva's words, quote, "to sit quietly and look innocent." Perhaps after having spent several hours talking with his client over the past several months, Minerva should have known that Ted Bundy was just not going to do that. No, he loves the attention, doesn't he? He's gonna be like all showman-y and all of this stuff. It's not going to work though, because he's going to get the death penalty. Yes! He does get the death penalty. Now I'm doubting myself, but it's like, yeah, no, Ted Bundy was executed. Unless I'm totally misremembering the end of the story. Minerva also broached with Bundy the idea of making a plea deal. He proposed that Bundy plead guilty to the Chi Omega murders in order to avoid the death penalty. Instead, Bundy would get a 75-year life sentence. Bundy was 32 at the time. While life behind bars was not appealing, it was a good long life. It would be a good long life spanning many decades, and it certainly beat a much shorter lifespan sitting on death row. Minerva was nevertheless surprised when Bundy approved of the idea. The defense lawyer approached the prosecution with the deal. Prosecutors snapped it up because they were none too confident that they had enough forensic evidence to secure a conviction, the teeth marks notwithstanding. On June 1st, 1979, Bundy was in court again to formally lodge his guilty plea. To everyone's surprise, Bundy stood up and made a speech in which he said, quote, oh, he's going to be like, I'm not guilty. Oh, God, here we go. It is my position that my counsel, 1, believe that I am guilty, 2, believe there is no way of presenting an effective defense, and 3, that they see no way of avoiding conviction. Your Honor, if that doesn't raise itself to the level of ineffectiveness of counsel, I don't know what does. All Minerva could do was sit there and watch in horror as Bundy sabotaged his own plea deal. Minerva then tried to resign from the trial, but Judge Cowart denied the motion. Instead, Minerva was forced to stay on the team, taking the role of advisory counsel. He didn't even attend much of the trial. Meanwhile, Cowart shockingly allowed Bundy to speak in his own defense, acting as co-counsel. Why are you allowing this to this man? Don't let him do that. That's why we have lawyers. And they're going to be a whole lot more boring than Ted Bundy, which is exactly what we want. A trial by farce, never before seen in American history, nor since, was about to begin. On July 1st, 1979, the trial was moved from Tallahassee to Miami. This was because too many people in Tallahassee were familiar with the Chi Omega attacks and hated Ted Bundy's guts. However, the move didn't do a fat lot of good. Bundy was now an international celebrity. There wasn't a single person in Florida who wasn't familiar with his reputation. Bundy's defense team tried to lodge a motion that their client was batshit crazy and unfit to stand trial. Judge Cowart ruled that not only was Bundy competent, but that he should be allowed to lead his own defense team and cross-examine witnesses. What followed was a circus. Ted Bundy, manic and erratic, ranted in the courtroom about everything from the amount of exercise he was permitted to the food he was getting to the lighting in his cell. Oddly enough, Coward was rather smitten with Bundy, won over by the man's charm, and granted many of Bundy's motions and requests. When Bundy cross-examined a first responder to the Kaimega murders, he unadvisedly asked the officer to describe the gore that he saw at the scene in, quote, as much detail as you can recall. To the jury, it looked like Bundy was reveling in the memory of the violence, which in truth, well, it probably was. Either way, this did not leave a good impression with the jury. No shit. And they were visibly uncomfortable during the officer's descriptions of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy's beaten, bloodied bodies. Yeah, I was uncomfortable with them. It was mega uncomfortable. If you don't feel uncomfortable listening to that, there's something wrong with you. You're like, oof. Some of the jurors were caught on camera giving Bundy very angry looks. Bundy's defense team was mortified. Never, ever would a defense lawyer cross-examine a first responder and ask for all the grisly details. But of course, Bundy wasn't a lawyer, and he was getting off on hearing another man describe his handiwork as if the officer in question was reading an extract of erotic fiction. That is so fucked up. Nita Neary, who had returned home to Kaimega that night and startled Bundy mid-murder, then took the stand. She had seen Bundy fleeing the house and came inside following a wild night out with her boyfriend. Nita described the man she saw in detail. She provided a picture via a sketch artist. At one point, Nita described the man she saw as nice-looking. Nita Neary then pointed out Bundy in the courtroom as the man she saw. Then, Ted Haggard, one of Bundy's defense lawyers, cross-examined Neary and successfully cast doubt on her ability to see Bundy in the dark for a matter of seconds while he fled the scene. It was a solid cross-examination, but then Bundy immediately got up and inexplicably tried to fire his entire defense team. Haggard merely asked to be excused and walked out of court without another word. Then the prosecution brought forward forensic odontologist. Is that like a dentist thing? Dr. Richard Souveron. He explained how the bite marks, there we go, okay, left on the body of Lisa Levy were a perfect match for the stone casts taken of Bundy's upper teeth. Souveron implied to the jury that the bite marks were like fingerprints. They were unique. In reality, bite marks are not like fingerprints or even as reliable as confirming a body's identity by looking at dental records. Bruise patterns that appear on a person's flesh do not necessarily reflect the unique arrangement of a person's teeth. A dozen other dermatological factors affect the shape of a bruise on a person's skin. Nowadays, bruises from bite marks are not considered decisive evidence, but this was the first time such science was trotted out in an American courtroom. The weight of the science was impressive for the jury, and Souveron spoke with enormous certainty that it was indeed Bundy's teeth that definitively left the marks. The impressiveness of the testimony affected Bundy himself. He was baffled by the evidence and could think of no effective way of refuting it. Throughout the trial, the gallery was packed with people. The grisly nature of the crimes, the dramatic figure of Ted Bundy speaking in his own defense, and the connection with over 30 other murders and disappearances of women elsewhere in the United States was just too much for people to resist. But most notably in the Miami courtroom was the presence of dozens of curious young women. A bizarre form of hybristophilia and Bundy mania had taken hold. Some of the girls trying to slip notes to Bundy saying all sorts of things, from proposing marriage to offering themselves for sex to assuring Bundy they knew he was innocent. Some young women also protested Bundy's innocence in front of journalists and news cameras. Other girls thought Bundy was as guilty as sin, but they were drawn to him anyway. Indeed, the charming 5'10", confident, smiling Bundy, cracking jokes and winking at the crowd, inspired adoration in many of them. And for some, the implication that he also was a violent psychopath and sexual sadist held a darker and more macabre allure. People who are into this, it's such a weird, thing.
I mean, Ted Bundy was kind of cute, right?
Like the women and stuff who write to serial killers in prison and get married to them and all of this stuff. It's like, what is up in your brain that makes this a good idea? Like, what's broken with you? Because this is so strange. It's like, they're not going to love you. They just want to wear your face as a mask. All right? It's Ted fucking Bundy. Also in the gallery was Carol Ann Boone, Bundy's former co-worker from Seattle and subsequent side piece while he was in a relationship with Liz Klopfer. Boone was in love with Bundy. She was arguably not right in the head, but she was not a hysterophiliac. She thought Bundy, or Bunny as she affectionately called him, was innocent. Boone spoke to the media on his behalf, once saying, quote, "The charges in Florida don't concern me any more than the things out west do." On July the 24th, 1979, the lawyers gave their closing arguments and the jury retired to deliberate. They were away for only 6.5 hours before returning. They found Bundy guilty of the first-degree murder of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy at Kaimega. Bundy remained impassive as the verdict was read. For a brief moment, the smirking and high confidence had ceased. Bundy was scared. A moment later, he was back to winking and smiling at the crowd, as if nothing had happened. His mother, Louise Bundy, was present in the courtroom. She broke down in tears. That night, Louise declared to the press that Bundy was innocent. On the day of Bundy's sentencing, Louise made a passionate appeal for the jury not to sentence her son to death. She said that her Christianity led her to believe that it was never justified to kill another human being, and that, quote, the laws of the state of Florida were not above the laws of God. For his part, Bundy told the jury it was, quote, absurd to ask for mercy for something he did not do. The jury passed the sentence of death upon Ted Bundy. Judge Cowart, independent of, but in accordance with the jury, passed the same sentence. After the sentence was read, Cowart spoke to Bundy, saying, quote, it's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity that I have experienced in this courtroom. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't have any animosity toward you. I want you to know that. Judge, have you been... I was just saying earlier, like, the judge is going to be taken in by his, like, charming ways. And I was like, you know, you murdered those two women in a horrible way, but you're all right, really. You're all right. You'd have been a good lawyer. You're a good old boy. Yeehaw. Maybe we can get a beer later. Why are you taken in by this psychopath? Jesus Christ, Judgy. Perhaps Judge Cowart would have felt a pinch of animosity if he had properly contemplated the waste of humanity. I thought that is what he was referring to. The waste of humanity being all the fucking murders at Kaimega, at Lake Sammamish, or at the Wildwood Inn, and a dozen other places around the country where women were brutally raped and slain. Yes, Judge Cowart. How can you say something like that? It's insane. It's Ted Bundy, and you know what he did, and you're like, he's all right. Yeah. Christ. On January the 1st, 1980, in Orlando, Florida, the Kim Leach murder trial began. The goal of this trial was to secure 2 death penalties against Bundy, just in case the one for Kaimega didn't hold up and got commuted to life. Florida prosecutors were determined to see Bundy fry, and the Kim Leach trial went well for the prosecution. Eyewitnesses came forward saying they saw Bundy forcing the 12-year-old into a white van at the junior high school. Other witnesses, I got no animosity towards you, my friends. I know you might have raped and murdered a 12-year-old girl, but that's all right. Yeah. What? Let's go get a brewski. The witnesses placed Bundy at the Holiday Inn the night before. A bloodstain found in the van matched Kim Leach's blood type. Semen in her underwear matched Bundy's blood type. Carpet fibers from the van were found on Kim Leach's clothing and vice versa. Bundy again represented himself as the trial. His arrogant and erratic behavior once again did not leave a good impression upon the jury. He was his own worst enemy. In one dramatic stunt, Bundy called Carol Ann Boone to the stand as a character witness. While he was questioning her, Bundy asked Carol to marry him. She said yes. Then, in a closing statement, Bundy spread out his arms and compared himself to Jesus Christ. These melodramatics only served to piss off a Florida jury. Yeah, they're probably like, oh my God, how can you hurry it up? I want to go home. How did I get on this trial? I thought I'd be here for like 3 days and then get to go home, but I'm on the fucking Ted Bundy second death sentence trial. Fortunately, I don't live in a country where they have jury trials. It's all done by judges, which, I mean, that's its own bag of worms. But I'm glad that I can't just randomly be called to go and, like, waste a ton of my life. Can you imagine if you're like, Simon, you've got to do jury duties? He's like, motherfucker, I'm busy. And it's crazy. Fuck that, man. That sounds bad. I understand that it's a civic duty and all of that shit, but it is annoying, isn't it? On February the 6th, 1980, the jury found Bundy guilty of the murder of 12-year-old Kim Leach. As the verdict was read, Bundy sat with his back to the courtroom. Afterward, while the jury was being escorted out, Bundy stood up and said to the judge quite venomously, "Tell the jury that they were wrong." Bundy was furious. He struggled with a guard while he was escorted from the courtroom. The prosecutor of the Kim Leach trial, Bob Dekel, was elated. He had been quite emotionally affected by the rape and murder of the 12-year-old girl, saying when police found her body that he had cried for the first time in his adult life. He described Bundy as, quote, a piece of garbage in the shape of a human being. For the murder of Kim Leach, Bundy was sentenced to death for a second time. This guy, Bob Dekel, sounds like a legend. And I like this. He's like, this affected me a lot. I'm taking on this case, and I'm going to fucking nail his bitch ass. And he did. And now he's got a second death penalty. Boom! The nature of the beast. Ted Bundy was placed on death row at Florida State Penitentiary in Rancourt. He appealed both death sentences. The Florida Supreme Court denied his appeal against the carmaker murders in 1982. Bundy's appeal against the death sentence for the murder of Kim Leach was denied in 1985. From that point forward, Bundy's legal efforts consisted of escaping the death penalty and having his sentence commuted to life in prison. Bundy was terrified of dying and would do anything to prolong his life. In order to cope with the ego-shattering reality of his downfall and disgrace in front of the entire nation, Bundy fell heavily into drugs and alcohol. Carol Ann Boone would smuggle the stuff into prison for him. For instance, she smuggled in marijuana vaginally, which Bundy took back to his cell rectally. For much of his 9 years on death row, Bundy was pretty fucked up on booze and weed. He claims to have hallucinated frequently. Meanwhile, Bundy also bribed the guards to overlook the fact that he'd have sex with Carol Ann Boone almost every time she visited. Conjugal visits were not allowed, but that did not stop Bundy from impregnating Boone and them having a daughter together in 1981 named Rosa. Why?
I don't understand. I don't understand, bitch.
Together with Boone's much older son from a previous marriage, the Bundys formed a twisted family unit. She passionately still believed in his innocence. In 1980, Ted Bundy began talking to journalists Stephen Mitchell and Hugh Ainsworth, who were writing a book. Bundy took care to speak in the third person about his crimes, pretending he was discussing the real culprit to avoid incriminating himself. He gave a number of insights into how and why he conducted his crimes, but he never confessed to anything in these interviews. Similarly, Bundy began talking with FBI profiler Bill Hagmaier. Bundy enthusiastically looked over unsolved cases with him, some of which Bundy probably committed, some of which were committed by active serial killers at the time, like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. For the FBI's part, when Bundy spoke, they sat up and took notice. He gave them tremendous new insight into how a psychopathic killer thought and operated. It was genuinely useful for them to sit down and talk to the man whom Hagmaier described as the Jack the Ripper of the United States. In addition to being a sadist, a rapist, and a murderer, Bundy revealed he was a kleptomaniac and chronic liar. Often he didn't need to steal stuff, and he didn't need to lie, but he did it anyway. It was all impulse-based behavior. Bundy derived a sense of power from doing something antisocial and criminal and getting away with it. It fed his narcissism. He was smarter than society. Says the dude sitting on death row. When it came to the murders and rapes specifically, Bundy gained sexual satisfaction from achieving total power and dominance over beautiful young girls. The desire to commit these heinous acts was overpowering, much like a drug addict seeking a fix, and would only subside once Bundy had successfully carried out such a crime. Bundy was cold, calculating and unflappable in the planning and execution of a kidnapping or a home invasion. Once the girl was knocked unconscious and or transported to a second location, it was only then that Bundy would allow himself to be overcome by bestial lust. Then he would become a true sadist and savage for a few minutes while he carried out the acts. Once Bundy orgasmed, the rational Bundy would return and the fear of panic would set in. He'd assiduously cover up his crime. In order to relive his sexual arousal, Bundy would take Polaroids of his dead victims. He would revisit the places where he dumped the bodies, and on at least half a dozen occasions he would decapitate the victim and keep the head in his apartment until it rotted. Bundy would also prolong things by committing acts of necrophilia. All of these actions were about possession. To Bundy, those girls, seemingly unobtainable in regular life, would be, to quote, his to do with what he pleased. From the 1960s to 1974, by Bundy's own admission, he required alcohol to overcome his inhibitions to carry out the kidnappings and murders. Carol de Ronch, for instance, reported smelling alcohol on his breath. Starting in 1975, however, those inhibitions had faded, and Bundy increasingly started carrying out his murders sober. Similarly, in its early years, Bundy's predations were primarily about gaining sexual pleasure from the rapes themselves. He would then kill the women to cover up his crimes. He initially did not revel in murder. It served utilitarian use for Bundy to keep him out of jail, but that doesn't mean Bundy felt remorse when it came to killing. He was incapable of that. Bundy's take on remorse is pretty twisted. Quote, "I believe I understand everything that I've done. I am in the enviable position of not having to feel any guilt. And that's it. Guilt is this mechanism we use to control people. It's an illusion. It's this kind of social control mechanism. and it's very unhealthy. The murders may have been utilitarian for the early kills, but after the slaughter of 74, Bundy began to derive intellectual and sexual satisfaction from the act of killing, as well as rape. Hence, Bundy began to start killing victims without necessarily penetrating them. For instance, at Kaimega, Bundy attacked 4 women within 15 minutes. Somewhere between 1975 and 1978, killing became an object in itself. Some experts have alleged that this is because Bundy just started to take a sort of sick pride from the number of women he killed. He realized he was very good at what he did, and this further fed his narcissism. Yes, Ted Bundy, you're an excellent serial killer. Well done. Everyone's so proud. Delusional, mate. Bundy was very skilled at committing murder without leaving much evidence. His fingerprints were never found at a single crime scene. Many of the bodies were never found. He'd take care to travel wide distances between murders, crossing state lines to frustrate investigations. He'd dump bodies in remote areas to delay their discovery. He'd burn clothing or donate it to Goodwill in order to avoid police collecting hairs and fibers from the articles. One reason why Bundy was only prosecuted for the kidnapping of Duranche and the Kaimega and Leach murders is because there was not enough evidence for most of the 30 or more women that Bundy killed to secure a conviction. There is one more factor to consider. Once Bundy killed, he would not feel the hunger for a while. Originally, a murder could satisfy Bundy for months, then only a few weeks. Then he became insatiable. It's quite clear that if Bundy had been allowed to continue his crimes, the pace at which he committed murder would have only accelerated. As it wasn't exactly slow, was it? Jesus. We are everywhere. In July 1984, Bundy was caught with 2 hacksaw blades, which he used to saw through a steel bar over one of the windows in his cell. In order to cover up his handiwork, Bundy had stuck the bar back in place using a weak glue made from prison soap. This is Bundy's last known escape attempt. Dude, escaping from death row. Surely that's got to be really hard. But I guess if you're in prison, it's all you think about, isn't it? After the Kim Leach appeal failed in 1985, Bundy hired 2 lawyers, James Coleman and Polly Nelson, to get him off the death penalty. Both regarded Bundy as a monster, but Coleman and Nelson were anti-death penalty idealists. To quote Polly Nelson, "Preventing the government from killing people in my name was one of the most important things I could do." I get it. I totally get it. But it's also Ted Bundy. He murdered a 12-year-old. There's no doubt beyond all reasonable doubt. We know it. It's a fact. Does he deserve to die? Yeah. Yeah, I think he does. I really think he does. All right, Polly. You do you. The argument his lawyers put forward was that Bundy had received inadequate representation at trial. Naturally, that inadequate representation was Bundy himself. He was not a lawyer, and his new team argued that Bundy was also out of his mind at the time of the murder trials in Florida. Bundy's massive ego was bruised, but he went along with the argument, too scared to die. But privately to Hagmaier, Bundy said, quote, "They knew damn well I wasn't crazy." In 1986, Coleman and Nelson achieved 2 stays of execution for Bundy, one 7 hours before Bundy was scheduled to be killed, another only 15 minutes before he was supposed to die. I think that is bordering on, cruel and unusual. That's almost like, what do they call it? A false execution, where they pretend to execute someone as a form of torture. In 1988, Bundy achieved yet another stay of execution. The public, by this point, were furious. Most people in Florida wanted him dead, and no judge really wanted to stand in the way of Bundy's execution. On January the 20th, 1989, the Florida Supreme Court denied Bundy another stay of execution. The next day, Bundy offered to confess to his crimes in an attempt to bait Florida's governor into prolonging his life for a few more years while he strung along police about his additional victims. This new strategy was dubbed Ted's Bones for Time scheme. Diana Weiner, a young Florida lawyer who had now become enamored with Bundy, even had the gall to approach the families of the victims and ask them to sign a petition asking the governor for more time. They all refused. Yes, as you would. Because it's like, no, wait, this is going to give him a stay of execution? You know he murdered my kids, right? Right? I want him in that chair. I want him strapped in that fucking chair. Go away. Bundy's mother, Louise, who had long proclaimed her son's innocence, was devastated. Speaking to the media in tears, she said, quote, "If he killed all those young women, we have several beautiful daughters of our own. It's a terrible thing. And he wasn't raised that way." Carol Ann Boone was furious and felt deeply betrayed that Bundy turned out to be guilty. She refused to accept a phone call from him the morning of his execution. She may have also been upset that Bundy had found a new flame in Diana Weiner. On January the 22nd, some authorities from the FBI and Washington State went back to speak to Bundy. He came up with a rough figure of 30 victims after spending a few hours adding them all up. This roughly equates to the existing figure of victims that we're aware of, though whether Bundy was telling the truth in this regard is a matter of conjecture. Some estimates go as high as 100, and Bundy often made comments that hinted at triple digits. He also said that for every one of his known murders, there was another that nobody knew anything about. When an FBI agent proposed a total of 36 girls, Bundy replied quietly, "Add one digit to that, and you'll have it." Okay, so it could be like 136, reasonably? Jesus. On January the 23rd, Bundy rehearsed his execution with FBI profiler Bill Hagmaier. During their conversation, Bundy said, quote, "Vengeance is what the death penalty is. Really, it's a desire for society to take an eye for an eye." Well, in this case, Ted, it's a desire for society to take one eye for 136 eyes, isn't it? Thereupon, Bundy threatened to kill himself to deny people the satisfaction of executing him. He grabbed a pen from the table and said, quote, "I can stick this so far up my artery, it'll squirt in your face." Hagmaier pointed out that killing himself was just adding one more number to the pile, which might not look good at the pearly gates. Bundy just laughed and said, "You got me again." That evening, Bundy had a meal of a burrito, rice, and salad. He gave an interview with evangelical leader Dr. James Dobson, where Bundy blamed all of his actions on his addiction to porn. Essentially, he'd graduated to harder and harder stuff until porn wasn't enough. Bundy went on to add that all male violence starts with an addiction to porn. He suggested that the FBI stake out adult movie theaters and take down names in case some of those men become future serial killers. Yes, Ted. Everyone who watches porn is going to become a serial killer. Clever stuff there. Bundy said, quote, "You're going to kill me, and that will protect society from me. But out there are many, many more people who are addicted to pornography, and you are doing nothing about that." Ted, let them just do their thing, okay? Because you just, no, come on. Bundy had corresponded with Dobson since 1987. In truth, Bundy's engaging with the Christian crusade against pornography was yet another attempt by him to prolong his life. Bundy admitted as much to Hagmaier, whom he told that he had committed the murders because he had wanted to. Porn did not drive him to do it. Bundy was woken up the next morning at 5 a.m. on January the 24th, 1989, where he was given a final meal of steak and eggs. Outside the prison, TV crews around the world lay in wait. Additionally, there was a crowd of thousands of onlookers who had been up all night partying. They drank, set off fireworks, sold electric chair pins and t-shirts. They let off chants like "Burn, Bundy, burn," which could be heard inside the prison. People had bottles of champagne at the ready for the moment when word of Bundy's death came. In the wider world, people got up early to watch it on TV. Local bars arranged Bundy-themed parties. One tavern put up a billboard, "Drink one to Bundy." Another advertised a Bundy barbecue special. An electronics store put up a sign saying, "These products won't zap you like Bundy." Holy shit, America. There's nothing more American than this, is there? I just... That's it, isn't it? Ted Bundy sat in his cell listening to the roaring cheers of drunken college kids, and he said, quote, "They're crazy. They think I am. But just listen to them." At 7 a.m., the doors of the death chamber swung open. In came Bundy, flanked with a guard on either side. He was terrified. White as a sheet, his head had been shaved, and he was strapped into the electric chair. Bundy turned to his lawyer, James Coleman, and priest Fred Lawrence, and said, quote, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Bundy then muttered something about being sorry for causing all this trouble as the black hood was pulled over his head. At 7:16 a.m., 2,000 volts ripped through Ted Bundy's body, and he died. After all the women and girls he had killed, it is perhaps noteworthy that the anonymous executioner was rumored to have been a woman. The execution witnesses jubilantly went outside to face the gathering throngs, and when the crowd realized Bundy was dead, they exploded into deafening cheers. Bundy's final words were fake and smarmy, showing a concern for others that he never really felt, that he was physically incapable of feeling. This was not the true man. More fitting are the words he uttered the night before while talking to James Dobson to quote, "We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow." Ted, that's fucking creepy. Fuck off. And now you're dead. Good. Dismembered appendices. Number 1. One additional victim thought to be Bundy's was 15-year-old Kathy Devine, who was murdered on November the 25th, 1973. The MO was similar. In 2001, DNA testing revealed that the real culprit was 27-year-old William E. Cosden Jr., who had recently been released from a mental institution where he had been kept for the 1967 murder of another woman. When interrogated in 1973, Cosden denied ever knowing Kathy Devine. In 1976, he was thrown in prison for a 48-year sentence, convicted of raping yet another woman. When confronted with the DNA evidence in 2001, he admitted having sex with Kathy Devine, but denied ever killing her. Number 2. In 1971, Bundy volunteered for a suicide hotline where he met a fellow volunteer, Ann Rule. She was already a true crime writer under the male pseudonym Andy Stagg. At the time Rule met Bundy, she thought he was kind and empathetic. She was completely taken in by his charisma. When Bundy was convicted of kidnapping Carol DeRonch in 1976 and connected with the murder of dozens of women, Rule began working on the first definitive biography of Ted Bundy, which she published in 1980 under the title The Stranger Beside Me. Ann Rule went on to become one of the foremost true crime writers of a generation. She died in 2015. Number 3. Bundy's work with FBI profilers directly inspired the relationship between Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling, as depicted in the 1991 movie Silence of the Lambs. Ted Bundy's handsome, clean-cut, and promising exterior masking a monster was also inspiration for the year 2000 movie American Psycho. Ted Bundy is also an inspiration for the character Dennis Reynolds in the long-running sitcom Always Sunny in Philadelphia, a handsome, narcissistic character who displays many of the traits associated with the so-called dark triad. Number 4. There have been many movies directed depicting the life and crimes of Ted Bundy, most of which, in my humble opinion of myself and my colleagues, are utter garbage. One of the most so bad it's goods adaptations is Ted Bundy, American Bogeyman. 2 good depictions are Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, which focuses on the agony of Bundy's girlfriend Liz Klopfer, and the 1980s classic, The Deliberate Stranger. Number 5. The cutthroat world of politics has been known to attract its share of congenital psychopaths, like we talked about earlier. Other such industries include commerce and law. Other serial killers who got involved in politics include John Wayne Gacy, who killed over 30 young men and buried many of them in his crawl space, Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer, who killed at least 16 people in Southern California, and Dorothea Puente, who killed homeless people and drug addicts and buried them in a back garden. These are the confirmed serial killers. No comment on suspected ones. Yeah, for sure. They're for sure. Number 6. The hybristophilia, inspired by the handsome and charismatic Ted Bundy, went far beyond groupies at his trial. Throughout his incarceration from 1980 to 1989, numerous women reported being obsessed with him, writing him letters, propositioning him, and creating photographic shrines in his honor. Even after his death, a number of hybristophiliacs have publicly expressed an attraction to or interest in Ted Bundy. What are you up to? In 2021, an Australian beauty queen, who is also publicly a self-professed sociopath, even released a novel where she plays a self-insert Mary Sue character who befriends and seduces Ted Bundy. Parts of the novel include Bundy and the character laughing at their victims. Bundy survivor Carol DeRonch has blasted the book for being inaccurate and hugely insensitive. Yes, and whoever this person is, we should keep an eye on them. Just keep an eye. Just a little looky look on them every now and again. This has been a very long episode of The Casual Criminalist, a very big episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Weird thing to say. I hope you enjoyed our exploration, analysis, thoughts on it. Thank you for listening or watching if you're watching on YouTube. If you are listening, why not leave a review? Thank you so much. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, like, all of that stuff. And I'll see you next time.